Get comfortable, settle in, pull the blanket a little closer, turn the lights down if you haven't already, and let this wash over you for the next few hours. Tonight we are going back to Springfield. But not the Springfield of famous moments and memorable catchphrases. We are going to a quieter part of that town, a part where the streets are a little dimmer, where the stories trail off mid-sentence, where a door was opened, something interesting was glimpsed on the other side, and then the door was gently, quietly, and completely deliberately shut without any explanation. The Simpsons has been on the air since the 17th of December, 1989, 36 seasons, nearly 800 episodes. It is the longest-running scripted primetime television show in American history, and it has generated more storylines, character arcs, and narrative threads than any single person could track across a lifetime of watching. And some of those threads were never finished. Some of them were introduced with real care and intention. Writers spent episodes building the groundwork. Characters were developed in specific directions. Relationships changed. People grew or fell apart or transformed into something new. The show committed, for a while, to following those threads wherever they led, and then it stopped. Sometimes mid-arc, sometimes after years of careful setup, sometimes right at the moment when the story was about to become something genuinely remarkable. No announcement, no resolution, no in-universe explanation. The storyline simply ceased to exist, absorbed back into Springfield's permanent present tense, and the show continued as though it had never started. That is what we are exploring tonight. The canceled arcs, the abandoned journeys, the storylines that began with real promise and ended with silence. We will move slowly through each one. There is no rush here. The night is long, and Springfield has plenty of quiet roads to walk down before morning. Section 1. Sideshow Bob and the Road to Redemption That Nobody Took. There is a version of Sideshow Bob's story that would have been one of the most emotionally complete character arcs in the history of American animation. The show came close to telling it, closer than most people realize. And then, gradually, without fanfare or explanation, it stopped. Let's start at the beginning, because Sideshow Bob's beginning is one of the most carefully constructed character origins the show ever built. Robert Underdunk Terwilliger Jr. was introduced in Season 1. He was the sidekick on Krusty the Clown's children's television program. A tall, imposing figure with an enormous shock of dark hair fanned out around his head like a peacock's tail, enormous feet, and the kind of cultured baritone voice that seemed profoundly out of place in the fluorescent chaos of a children's morning program. He was played by Kelsey Grammer, whose voice alone carried a weight of barely contained dignity that made every frame Bob appeared in feel slightly electric. His first act was to frame Krusty for armed robbery. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Bob had grown tired of being second, tired of the slapstick, the pies in the face, the constant physical humiliation of his role as the butt of every joke in a show designed for children. He had genuine intelligence, genuine culture, genuine ambition. He wanted more than Springfield could offer a man of his particular sensibilities. And so he framed his employer, took over the show, and for a brief, glittering moment, transformed it into something refined and genuinely educational. He taught children about art history and classical literature. He spoke to them as though they were capable of understanding complexity. And then Bart figured out what he had done, exposed him, and Bob went to prison. That was the beginning. And already, even in that very first episode, the show had established something more nuanced than a simple villain. Bob had a reason. Bob had a grievance that was, at its core, not entirely unjust. He was a brilliant man trapped in a degrading job, and he responded to that indignity in the most catastrophic way imaginable. But the indignity was real. The frustration was real. The show built on this carefully across the seasons that followed. Bob escaped from prison and ran for mayor of Springfield in a Season 3 episode called Sideshow Bob Roberts. He did not merely run. He won, through a sophisticated voter fraud scheme that the episode depicts with a kind of gleeful procedural detail. And what he planned to do with that power was specific. He intended to demolish the Simpson family's house to build a freeway. The target was Bart, always Bart, the boy who had humiliated him and sent him to prison. The revenge was personal, but the method was institutional. Bob had understood something that most cartoon villains never grasp, which is that the most durable kind of power comes from structures and systems rather than from direct action. That episode also gave us something quietly important. In the background of the campaign, in the moments between the plot mechanics, Bob displayed a genuine political philosophy. He was a Republican, the episode makes this explicit, but he was a particular kind of Republican. A patrician conservative with actual intellectual convictions about the shape of society. Not a buffoon, not a caricature. A man with a coherent worldview who had simply decided to pursue that worldview through fraud because the legitimate path had been closed to him. Season 5 gave us Cape Fear, which is almost certainly the most famous Sideshow Bob episode. Bob is released from prison again. He stalks the Simpson family. They enter the witness protection program. He follows them. He corners Bart on a houseboat. And then, in the episode's most famous moment, he is stalled from killing Bart by being forced to perform the entire score of the HMS Pinafore because Bart asked him to. Cape Fear is a brilliant piece of comedy. It is also, if you look at it carefully, the episode where something started to shift in how the show understood Bob's story. Because Cape Fear is almost entirely about the comedy of Bob's situation, the rakes, the elephants, the pinafore. The episode leans fully into the absurdity of a man of Bob's refinement caught in the mechanical chaos of cartoon violence. And that is funny, extremely funny. But it moves Bob for the first time, slightly away from genuine menace and slightly towards something more theatrical. He is becoming, slowly and probably unintentionally, a figure of comedic grandeur rather than actual threat. The show was aware of this tension for a while. The next several Bob episodes tried to hold both things at once, the comedy and the genuine darkness underneath it. Season 7's Brother from Another Series is where the real story began. Cecil Terwilliger, Bob's younger brother, was introduced in that episode. David Hyde Pierce voiced him, which was the kind of perfect casting that feels almost too good to be real, given that Pierce and Grammer were playing brothers on Frasier at exactly that time. Cecil had grown up in Bob's shadow. He had wanted to be Krusty's sidekick himself. He had auditioned. Bob had gotten the job instead, not because Bob was better suited for it, but because Krusty had mistaken Bob's expression of disdain for the job as a comedy performance and hired him on the spot. Cecil had practiced for years. Cecil had trained. Cecil was passed over for a man who was actively expressing contempt for the opportunity. The episode used this to do something genuinely interesting. It put Bob in the position of the innocent party. Cecil had embezzled a fortune from a dam construction project and was framing Bob for it, settling a decades-old score. Bart, who despised Bob, had to team up with him to expose Cecil and prevent the dam from collapsing. What emerged from that episode was a portrait of two brothers, shaped by the same family, the same upbringing, the same particular brand of Terwilliger intelligence and pride, but warped in opposite directions by the specific humiliations they had each absorbed along the way. Bob was violent and theatrical. Cecil was precise and cold. Bob chased Bart because the grudge was personal and consuming. Cecil engineered his revenge because the accounting of old debts was, to him, a matter of elegant necessity. And after that episode, Cecil essentially disappeared. He returned in much later seasons, briefly, but the thread between the brothers, the examination of what it meant to be a Terwilliger, the question of whether these two men were mirror images or fundamentally different creatures, that was never developed further. It was a door the show opened, looked through with obvious interest, and then left ajar without ever walking through. But the most important abandoned thread in Bob's story came a few seasons later. In season 15, there is an episode called The Italian Bob. The Simpson family travels to Italy and discovers that Bob has been living there, in a small Tuscan village, happily married to a woman named Francesca and with a young son named Gino. He has built a life. He has left Springfield behind. He has a community that respects him, a wife who loves him, a child who looks up at him with the particular, uncomplicated trust that small children extend to their fathers. When the Simpsons accidentally expose his true identity to the villagers, the community turns on him. His reputation is destroyed. The life he has built is dismantled in a single evening, and Bob, Francesca, and baby Gino are forced to flee. That episode ends with the three of them on the run, their new life shattered, and Bob making the decision that he is going to go back to trying to kill Bart. Not because he genuinely wants to, not because the old rage has returned, but because the life he wanted to live has been taken from him, again. and the only identity left available to him is the one that Springfield assigned him years ago. Sit with that for a moment. Because that is genuinely moving. That is a story about a man who tried to escape the worst version of himself, who built something real and good and quiet, and who had it destroyed through no particular fault of his own. The tragedy of Bob in that episode is not that he is a villain. It is that he is a man who keeps trying to stop being a villain and keeps finding that the world will not let him. Francesca and Gino became recurring characters for a few seasons after that. The family dynamic, a former attempted murderer, his devoted Italian wife, and their terrifyingly violent infant son, provided a genuinely fresh angle on Bob's story. Gino, barely old enough to walk, displayed the same homicidal intensity as his father but wrapped in the anarchic energy of a toddler. It was darkly funny and also oddly touching. Bob was, in these episodes, a father, a husband, someone with people depending on him. Season 17 brought an episode called Funeral for a Fiend, in which Bob fakes his own death to lure Bart into a trap, is foiled again, and ends up in prison again. And gradually, across the next several seasons, the weight of the Italian storyline, the family, the genuine attempt at redemption, was simply absorbed back into the show's default setting. Bob became, again, primarily a comedic figure. The attempts to kill Bart became increasingly theatrical and increasingly less connected to any genuine psychological truth. There was a moment, around seasons 15 through 18, when the show was clearly working toward something. The arc with Francesca and Gino suggested a future in which Bob might find some form of genuine resolution, not redemption in a tidy, sentimental sense, but resolution. A place where the story of Robert Terwilliger could arrive at something that felt like the truth about who he was and what his life had cost him. That future never arrived. The later seasons gave us an episode where Bob finally kills Bart in what the show presents as a fantasy or alternate version of events, and then resurrects him immediately. They gave us episodes where the killing attempts became so elaborate and so disconnected from any emotional reality that they felt more like magic tricks than stories. They gave us Bob in increasingly absurd situations. They never gave us the ending that the Italian storyline suggested was possible. The version of Bob's story that was quietly canceled is the one in which a man of genuine intelligence and genuine capacity for love figures out, slowly and painfully, how to stop being what his worst impulses made him. The evidence for that story is right there in the show. The Italian village, Francesca, the way Bob looked at his son. The particular exhaustion visible in Bob's face in the Italian Bob when the Simpsons arrive and everything begins to fall apart. The show built the foundation. It laid every brick, and then it just stopped building. What remains is the outline of a structure that was never completed. And if you watch those episodes in sequence, if you follow Bob's journey from the children's television sidekick who framed his employer all the way to the husband and father in Tuscany who just wanted to grow grapes and read books and put Springfield behind him, you can see exactly what the story was trying to become. You can also see very clearly where it stopped trying. Drop a comment below with where you are in the world and what time it is. And if you are just discovering this channel, consider subscribing. There are hours more of this ahead, and Springfield has plenty of quiet roads left to walk. Section 2. Apu Nahasapi Mapedalon and the Story That Should Have Been Told. Apu Nahasapi Mapedalon ran the Quick E-Mart on the corner of Elm Street and First Avenue in Springfield for the entire run of the show's classic era. He was, for many seasons, one of the most richly developed supporting characters in the series. He had a history. He had a philosophy. He had contradictions built into him that felt genuinely human rather than simply comic. And then his story was abandoned in a way that is, when you actually trace it, one of the strangest narrative decisions the show ever made. Let us begin with what the show established about Apu, because the foundation is more impressive than most people remember. Apu Nahasapi Mapedalon came to the United States from India. He attended the Springfield Heights Institute of Technology, which the show cheerfully abbreviates as SHIT. And in the episode Much Apu About Nothing, we learn his full history with remarkable specificity. He arrived in America on a student visa, fell in love with the country, and when his visa expired, he stayed anyway. He became an illegal immigrant. He worked. He studied. He earned a doctorate in computer science. He passed his American citizenship test with a perfect score, while Homer, who was supposed to be helping him study, answered every single question wrong. That episode aired in 1996 during season 7, and it was treating immigration with a seriousness that the show rarely gave to any political subject. The episode did not use Apu's immigration status for easy comedy. It used it to examine what it actually costs someone to build a life in a country that is not entirely sure it wants them there. The Springfield population, having passed a referendum targeting immigrants, turns on Apu. The family has to decide whether to stand by him or comply with the community's decision. Homer, who was responsible for passing the referendum in the first place by putting his name on a petition he hadn't read, ultimately does the right thing. He stands up for Apu. Apu takes his citizenship test and passes. It is one of the quieter, more genuinely thoughtful episodes of the show's middle period, and it established Apu not as a convenience store stereotype, but as a specific person with a specific history and a specific set of sacrifices behind him. Then came the two misses. Nahasapi Mapatilons, Season 9, in which Apu is pressured by his mother to accept an arranged marriage to a woman named Manjula. The episode plays the setup for comedy, and there is plenty of comedy in it, but it also does something more careful in the margins. It asks what it costs Apu to carry two cultural identities simultaneously. He has been American long enough to resist the arranged marriage. He has been Indian enough that his mother's expectation carries genuine weight. The episode navigates that tension with more grace than you might expect. Apu and Manjula marry at the end of the episode. Season 10 gave us 8 Misbehavin', in which Manjula gives birth to octuplets. This is where the show began making choices about Apu's story that felt less considered. The octuplet storyline was primarily comedic. 8 babies, all requiring simultaneous attention, Apu and Manjula overwhelmed and exhausted, the chaos of sudden parenthood magnified by a factor of 8. It was funny. But it also marked the moment when the show stopped building Apu as a character with inner depth and started using him primarily as the source of situational comedy. The octuplets largely vanished from the show after the episode that introduced them. 8 children who should, by any realistic storytelling logic, have transformed every aspect of Apu and Manjula's daily existence were quietly moved to the background and then essentially forgotten. The show was not interested in exploring what it actually meant to raise 8 children simultaneously while running a 24-hour convenience store. It was interested in the joke of the premise. But the larger abandoned storyline is something more specific. Across seasons 8, 9, and 10, the show was carefully building toward an examination of Apu's marriage that was genuinely complex. Manjula's character, as she developed across multiple episodes, was not simply a supporting player in Apu's story. She had her own perspective on their relationship. She had her own grievances. She had a particular kind of quiet intelligence that expressed itself through observation rather than confrontation. Season 12 brought Homer and Apu, an episode that revisited Apu's position at the Quick E-Mart, his relationship with Hank Scorpio and the corporate structure above him, and his sense of identity in Springfield. And woven through it was the beginning of something the show appeared to want to address about what Apu's daily life actually looked like after a decade of marriage and fatherhood in a town that had never entirely figured out how to see him as a full person. There were episodes across this period that suggested the show was building toward a genuine examination of Apu and Manjula's marriage. The specific stresses of their life together, the way his work consumed every waking hour, the way her expectations and his actual presence in the family were beginning to diverge, the way 2 people from the same cultural background could still end up in a marriage where one of them felt invisible. Season 13 gave us a brief, quiet moment in which Manjula and Apu were shown navigating something in their relationship that was left deliberately underexplored. The show was circling something. You could feel it in the writing. And then it stopped circling. The decision to step back from Apu as a significant character was not announced and not explained. It happened gradually. His appearances in later seasons became increasingly peripheral. Manjula appeared less. The octuplets were rarely mentioned. The rich backstory established across the first decade of the show's run, the immigration history, the doctorate, the arranged marriage, and what it cost both of them to build a life inside it, was simply allowed to fade. There is a conversation to be had about the reasons for this. about the controversy surrounding the character's portrayal and the broader cultural reckoning that began around 2017. But that conversation is separate from what we are examining tonight. What we are examining is the narrative itself, the stories that were being built and the stories that were abandoned. And the story that was abandoned in Apu's case is a genuinely interesting one. The show had spent years establishing a character who carried within him a specific kind of American experience, the experience of someone who chose this country at great personal cost and has been building a life here ever since, navigating the gap between where he came from and where he is now, between who his family expected him to be and who this particular place and this particular life was turning him into. That is a story with genuine emotional territory in it. The show had the character to tell it. It had the history, it had the supporting cast in Manjula, in the Springfield community, in the accumulated weight of all those established episodes. It never told the story. What remains is the accumulation of detail without the arc. All those carefully established facts about Apu's life, his doctorate, his immigration, his marriage, his 8 children, his relationship with the Quickie Mart and what it represented for him, are still there in the episodes. They did not disappear. They are perfectly preserved, like the contents of a house that was packed up for a move that never happened. The journey that those details were pointing toward is another matter. That journey was quietly canceled without ceremony. And in its absence, one of the show's most potentially rich human stories remains permanently suspended somewhere between setup and resolution. Section 3. Troy McClure and the story the show was too afraid to tell. Phil Hartman died on the 28th of May, 1998, shot by his wife in their home in Encino, California. He was 49 years old. His death ended one of the greatest recurring character relationships in the history of The Simpsons. Troy McClure and Lionel Hutz, both voiced by Hartman, were quietly retired after his death as an act of respect. The show never recast them. It simply let them go. And in letting them go, it also let go of something that, in retrospect, looks like the beginning of a very interesting and very dark story that the show had been building toward for years. Troy McClure was a has-been actor. That was his function in the show's world. He appeared in those famous self-promotional intros. "Hi, I'm Troy McClure. You may remember me from such films as..." and then a list of increasingly absurd fake movie titles. He was the face of a particular kind of faded Hollywood celebrity, the person who had been somebody and was now doing infomercials and industrial safety films and whatever else the entertainment industry made available to a man of his reduced circumstances. He was also, beneath the comedy, something genuinely complicated. Season 7 gave us A Fish Called Selma, one of the most quietly unsettling episodes in the show's history. Troy McClure, whose career has been further damaged by rumors of a bizarre personal life that the episode is deliberately vague about, hatches a plan to rehabilitate his image by marrying Selma Bouvier. The marriage is entirely cynical on his side. He needs a relationship visible enough to counteract the rumors. Selma needs something to hold on to as she ages alone. The episode is, on its surface, a comedy about celebrity image management. But underneath it, the show does something much stranger. The rumors about Troy's personal life are never fully explained. The episode gestures at them through implication and innuendo. Chief Wiggum references them. Various Springfield residents reference them. The joke is that the rumors involve something so bizarre and so specific that simply mentioning fish around Troy causes significant embarrassment. The episode does not spell out what the rumors mean. It trusts the audience to draw their own conclusions or to remain baffled, and either response serves the comedy. But the way the episode deploys these rumors suggests something more than a throwaway gag. The show is implying that Troy has been carrying a secret for years, that this secret has damaged his career and his relationships, that he has been managing the public perception of this secret through a combination of charm, deflection, and the general willingness of Springfield's population not to ask uncomfortable questions. The episode also does something quietly remarkable with Troy as a person. In the scenes where he is alone with Selma, away from the public performance of their relationship, there is something almost tender between them. Not romantic love, but a genuine recognition of shared loneliness. Two people who have both ended up somewhere they did not expect, getting through each day by performing a version of themselves that the world finds more palatable than the truth. The marriage ends. Selma leaves when she realizes Troy is using her. Troy, freed from the necessity of maintaining the public relationship, returns to whatever his life looked like before. And here is where the abandoned storyline begins. A fish called Selma was clearly establishing something. The rumors, the secret, the particular quality of Troy's public performance, these were not elements being introduced for a single episode and then discarded. They were the beginning of a character study. The show was building toward a fuller examination of what it cost Troy to maintain the version of himself he presented to Springfield. What it cost him to be Troy McClure rather than whoever he actually was underneath the performance. Phil Hartman was extraordinary at this. His voice work for Troy had a quality that went beyond simple satire of faded celebrity. There was something melancholy in it, something that suggested real loss behind the relentless cheerfulness of the self-promotion. The "Hi, I'm Troy McClure, you may remember me from" was a joke, but it was also a cry for recognition from a man who had learned to package his need for attention into a format the world could tolerate. There were follow-up episodes planned, not confirmed publicly in detail, but the internal logic of the storyline in A Fish Called Selma is pointed very clearly towards somewhere. The show had introduced a mystery around Troy's character that it intended to develop. Then Phil Hartman died, and the story ended. What remains is A Fish Called Selma as a standalone episode that functions beautifully on its own terms, but also carries the weight of being the beginning of something that never became anything else. If you watch it knowing what was to come, knowing that the story it started would never be continued, it takes on a particular quality. Troy McClure at the end of that episode is a man who is going home to an empty house after a public marriage that was designed to manage the perception of a secret he has never shared with anyone. He is alone in the specific way that people with carefully managed public personas are alone, surrounded by versions of themselves that the world approves of, with no one who knows the actual person underneath. That is a story. A complete and genuinely rich story about what celebrity does to a human being and what it costs to maintain a public self when the private self is something the world has decided it does not want. The show was going to tell that story. And then the person who could tell it was gone, and the door closed, and Troy McClure's secret went with him. There is something fitting about this in a way that feels too painful to articulate cleanly. Troy McClure was a character about the gap between public performance and private reality, about the exhausting work of maintaining an image that protects you from having to be known. And the actor who brought him to life did not survive his own private reality. Whatever Phil Hartman was carrying in the last months of his life, whatever pressures and griefs and difficulties existed behind the extraordinary charm of his public work, those things were not visible on screen. Just as Troy's secret was not visible on screen, just as the story was never told, the show chose not to recast the characters. And that decision was right. It was correct and respectful and the only possible choice. But it meant that the story Troy McClure was building toward went with him into silence. Hi, I'm Troy McClure. You may remember me from the story that was never finished. Section 4. Marge Simpson's gambling addiction and the recovery that wasn't. In Season 5, the show gave us Dollar Springfield, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love Legalized Gambling. It is a brisk, funny, somewhat chaotic episode about what happens when Springfield legalizes gambling and a casino opens in town. Burns builds the casino. Homer becomes a blackjack dealer. Bart runs an underground casino in his treehouse. And Marge develops a gambling addiction. The addiction is played with surprising seriousness for a comedy episode. Marge finds a slot machine and discovers, in the specific way that addiction discovers people, that it fills something in her. There is a scene where she is sitting at the machine while Maggie is alone in the hotel room crying, and Marge can hear the crying distantly and keeps pulling the lever anyway. That is not a comedy moment. That is a portrait of compulsion. The specific mechanics of how a person who loves their child can nevertheless be unable to stop doing something that pulls them away from that child. By the end of the episode, Homer notices what is happening. He sets up a makeshift casino in their home to help Marge practice resisting temptation. It is sweet and clumsy and deeply Homerish. Marge acknowledges the problem. There is a resolution of sorts, and then the addiction vanished from the show entirely. In subsequent episodes, Marge visits casinos without any suggestion that this might be difficult for her. She plays games of chance without any of the specific compulsive quality the show had established. The addiction was treated as a single episode problem that had been resolved by the end credits and required no further management. This is the show making a choice that the show makes frequently, treating a character development as an isolated event rather than something that permanently changes who the character is. But the gambling addiction is a particularly striking example of this, because the episode itself was so deliberate in establishing the addiction as real and serious. Compare the treatment of Homer's alcoholism, which the show periodically revisits and never quite resolves, or Lisa's vegetarianism, which the show has maintained as a consistent character trait for decades, or Bart's academic struggles, which recur across seasons as a genuine ongoing dimension of his character. These are character traits that the show decided to honor with continuity. Marge's gambling addiction was not given that honor. What was being set up in Springfield was genuinely interesting. Marge is the load-bearing wall of the Simpson family. She is the person who keeps everything functional, who notices when things are wrong, who absorbs the household's various crises and keeps moving. The gambling addiction was the show, asking what happens when the person holding everything together develops her own crack. When the one who fixes everyone else needs fixing herself. That is a rich question. It does not have a comedy answer. It has the kind of answer that would require the show to sit with Marge's interiority for a sustained period and take seriously what her daily life actually costs her. The show was not ready to do that in season 5. It may never have been ready to do it. But the episode exists as evidence that someone in the writer's room was thinking about it. Someone was willing to establish the premise that Marge's composure was not infinitely self-sustaining, that underneath the patience and the reliability and the soft blue tower of hair, there was a person under pressure who had found her own form of escape. That person never got her storyline. What we have instead is a single episode, a remarkably well-crafted episode, that functions as a short story about something that could have been the spine of a much longer narrative. The gambling addiction as the entry point into a genuine examination of Marge's inner life. The crack in the wall that finally allows the show to look at what is happening inside the person who has been holding the wall up. Instead, the crack was patched. The wall was restored to its default condition. And Marge went back to being the person who absorbs everything and keeps moving. There are other Marge-centered episodes across the show's run that gesture toward this territory. The episode where she develops agoraphobia, the episode where she has a drinking problem herself, briefly. The episode where she becomes so consumed by painting that she neglects her family. In each of these, the show recognizes something about Marge that it never quite commits to developing over time. That she has a psychology more complex and more pressurized than her patient surface suggests. Each time it recognizes this, it addresses it for 22 minutes and then sets it aside. The gambling addiction is the most sustained and most serious of these gestures, and it is the one that most clearly points toward a version of Marge's story that the show never told. A version in which her composure is not a permanent and reliable feature of her character, but something she works to maintain. Something that has costs. Something that, under sufficient pressure, breaks. The version where Marge Simpson is a full person rather than a function. That story was quietly canceled. The slot machine sits silent in the corner of a Springfield casino that Marge visits in later episodes without a second glance because the show decided that the woman who sat at that machine for hours while her baby cried had been fully resolved by a single episode and a makeshift home casino. She had not been resolved. She had simply been moved on from. Section 5. Bart and Greta Wolfcastle and the relationship that quietly dissolved. Season 11 gave us the episode Bart the Lover. Season 12 gave us a different kind of romantic story for Bart, and Season 14 gave us a surprisingly careful examination of adolescent romantic pain in an episode called The Bart Wants What It Wants. That episode centered on Bart's relationship with Greta Wolfcastle, the daughter of Rainier Wolfcastle, Springfield's resident action movie star and Arnold Schwarzenegger stand-in. Greta was smart, gentle, slightly sad underneath the privilege of her life, and genuinely interested in Bart as a person rather than as a performance of toughness or coolness. The episode moves carefully. Bart, who pursues Greta initially with the same casual attitude he brings to most things, gradually discovers that she actually likes him. And his response to this discovery is the response of someone who does not know how to handle being genuinely seen. He panics. He pulls back. He treats her with careless indifference precisely because she is not being indifferent to him, and genuine attention from someone is more frightening than rejection. Greta eventually gives up on him and starts dating Milhouse, which produces in Bart an entirely irrational surge of jealousy that has nothing to do with actual feelings for Greta and everything to do with the specific territorial quality of male adolescence. The episode follows the Simpsons and the Wolfcastles to Toronto, where the jealousy plays out against the backdrop of a foreign city and ends inconclusively. The conclusion is honest about adolescence in a way the show did not always commit to. Bart does not get the girl. He does not have a satisfying resolution. He learns something vague and uncomfortable about the gap between what he wants and how he behaves, and that learning is left deliberately incomplete because that is how adolescence actually works. And then Greta was never seen again. Rainier Wolfcastle continued to appear in the show periodically, but Greta, who had been developed with a specificity and emotional completeness that many one-episode characters never approach, simply disappeared without any acknowledgement that she had existed. This is worth slowing down for, because what the episode established between Bart and Greta was genuinely unusual for the show. The Simpsons is not a show that typically allows Bart to be emotionally vulnerable. His character is built around performance. The prank, the attitude, the defiant grin that maintains a particular public version of himself. Greta was the episode's attempt to show what Bart looks like when that performance is not working, when someone is looking at him with enough attention that the armor starts to show its edges. The show has done this with Bart occasionally across its run. The episode where he falls in love with a girl from a rival school. The episode where his relationship with a female pen pal becomes something more than he expected. The show keeps gesturing toward Bart's emotional life as a territory worth exploring and then backing away from it. The Wolfcastle storyline was the most complete of these gestures. Greta was drawn as a character with her own interiority, her own loneliness, her own particular quality of growing up inside a famous family and finding the world outside it both appealing and slightly mysterious. There was enough material there to continue. The Wolfcastle household as a recurring setting. Greta as a character who understood Bart in ways that his closer friends did not. The ongoing question of what Bart does with genuine emotional connection when it is offered to him without the safety net of irony. The show chose not to continue it. Greta Wolfcastle is somewhere in Springfield, presumably. She exists in the same eternal present that all of Springfield's characters inhabit. But the story that should have grown from the episode that introduced her was quietly folded away. What was canceled was not just a relationship. What was canceled was the version of Bart's story in which someone looks past the performance and sees the actual person, and that person has to figure out what to do about being seen. Section 6. Smithers, Burns, and the Long Unsaid Thing. For 30 years, the show built one of the most emotionally complex relationships in American animation and then steadfastly refused to do anything definitive with it. Waylon Smithers and Charles Montgomery Burns. The devoted personal assistant and the ancient billionaire who barely registers his existence as a distinct human life. Let us be precise about what the show established, because the precision matters. Smithers' feelings for Burns were established early and maintained consistently across the entire run of the classic era. This was not a background detail. It was not a joke planted in a single episode for easy laughs. It was a sustained characterization that the show returned to again and again with a specificity that went well beyond what would be required for a simple recurring gag. Smithers knew Burns' schedule. He knew his medical needs. He knew his preferences, his fears, his vanities, his weaknesses. He maintained Burns' life with the devotion of someone who has made that life the organizing principle of their own. In a Season 2 episode, we see Smithers' dream, and in that dream, Burns appears at his window like a vision. The dream is not ambiguous. The show was explicit about Smithers' feelings while being, for a long time, deliberately indirect about how it categorized them. The word gay was not used in connection with Smithers for the show's early seasons. The show relied on implication, on the visible weight of Smithers' attachment, on the humor of Burns' total obliviousness, to establish something that everyone in the audience understood without requiring direct statement. This indirection had its own quality. There was something about the way the show handled Smithers' feelings that was, for its time, more honest than many direct treatments. By refusing to reduce his attachment to a label and a plotline, The show allowed it to exist as something more complicated, a love that had organized an entire life around an object that would never reciprocate, that barely registered the devotion being offered to it. Season 6 gave us Homer versus Patty and Selma, which touched on Smithers' situation at its edges. Season 8 gave us brief, carefully weighted glimpses into the cost of his devotion. Season 9 explored what happened to Burns when Smithers was absent, and by extension, what Smithers' presence actually meant to the functioning of that household. And then, in Season 27, after decades of implication and careful indirection, the show addressed Smithers' sexuality directly. He came out. The episode was called The Burns Cage, and it centered on Smithers' attempt to find a relationship with someone who might actually return his feelings. The episode was received warmly. It was considered a meaningful step, and it was, in many ways, well done, but it also marked the end of something rather than the beginning. Because the Burns-Smithers dynamic, in its long pre-resolution form, had been building towards something that the show never quite got to. The question that 30 seasons of implication had been circling was not simply whether Smithers would come out. It was what would happen to his relationship with Burns if and when his feelings for Burns were made explicit. What would Burns do with that information? What would it mean for a man of Burns's generation, disposition, and extraordinary self-involvement to be confronted directly with the fact that his personal assistant had organized his entire life around an attachment that was not simply professional loyalty? The show gave us the coming out story. The show gave us the search for another relationship. But the most interesting story, the one that all that careful setup was pointing toward, was the confrontation between Smithers and Burns about the actual nature of what had existed between them for 30 years. That confrontation never happened. Burns in later seasons acknowledged Smithers' feelings in various ways. Some of them played for comedy, some of them slightly more tender. But the full reckoning, the scene in which these two people look at what their relationship has actually been and say something true about it, was never written. What was quietly canceled was the ending of the longest relationship in the show, not its conclusion, because the show will not end and therefore nothing in it can properly conclude, but the moment of real honesty between two characters who had been dancing around the truth of their connection for 3 decades. Smithers deserved that moment. The story had earned it. And the show, for reasons that probably have more to do with the difficulty of writing it than with any deliberate decision to avoid it, never provided it. What remains is one of the most sustained portraits of unrequited devotion in the history of the medium. 30 years of a man dedicating himself completely to someone who barely sees him. That is a story. An extraordinary, melancholy, occasionally funny, ultimately devastating story about the specific way that love can organize a life around an absence. The show told that story beautifully and by accident, across 3 decades of individual episodes, each of which was not trying to tell it but contributed to it anyway. The story it was consciously building toward, the one with a real ending, the one in which Burns finally sees Smithers clearly and something true passes between them, that one was canceled. It is still waiting in the space between every episode where Smithers looks at Burns and Burns looks elsewhere. Section 7. Lisa's Buddhism and the spiritual life nobody followed up on. In Season 13, there is an episode called She of Little Faith. Lisa, disillusioned by the commercialization of the church she has attended her entire life, begins exploring other spiritual traditions and eventually converts to Buddhism. She takes the conversion seriously. She does not treat it as a passing interest. She finds a genuine community, a teacher, and a framework for understanding the world that feels, for the first time, genuinely consistent with who she is. The episode ends with Lisa as a Buddhist, not tentatively, not with the suggestion that this might be a phase. She is a Buddhist. Richard Gere appears in the episode to affirm the legitimacy of her path, which the show deploys with characteristic self-awareness about the Hollywood Buddhism Association. The conversion is presented as real and as hers, and then the show honored it. For a while, Lisa's Buddhism was maintained as a consistent character trait across several subsequent seasons. It informed her choices. It gave her an ethical framework that was distinct from the vague mainline Protestantism of the rest of the family. When Lisa faced moral questions, her Buddhist perspective was part of how she thought through them. This was a genuine commitment on the show's part, and it deserves acknowledgement. The vegetarianism, established years earlier, had been maintained. The Buddhism, initially, was treated with similar respect. But the show never went where the Buddhist conversion was pointing. Because Lisa's Buddhism, if taken seriously, raises questions about her family's life that the show was not prepared to answer. The nuclear power plant that her father works at is, under any ethical framework, a problem. The passive acceptance of Springfield's various corruptions and injustices that her family participates in daily is, from a Buddhist perspective, not simply passive, it is complicity. Lisa's Buddhism should, by its own logic, deepen her existing alienation from the life she is living and make more acute the question of how she is going to grow up in a family and a town that are, by her own values, deeply compromised. The show touched on this territory. The Lisa episodes during the period when her Buddhism was most consistently honored are among the more genuinely searching episodes in the series. She is trying to live a considered life inside an unconsidered world. The specific friction this creates between who she is and where she is, between what she believes and what her daily existence requires her to participate in, should be the engine of her story for everything that follows. Instead, the Buddhism gradually became a background detail rather than an active feature of her character. It was not explicitly abandoned. Lisa did not unconvert. The show did not write an episode in which she returned to Christianity or declared her Buddhism a failed experiment. It simply stopped being something the show engaged with in any substantive way. The Buddhism became a footnote. What was quietly canceled was the spiritual life of a child who had found something that genuinely fit her. The exploration of what it means to hold a real ethical framework and try to live by it inside a world that is fundamentally indifferent to ethics. The ongoing conversation between Lisa's values and Springfield's reality. Lisa is the show's conscience. She has always been the character who asks the questions nobody else will ask, who names the problems nobody else will name, who refuses to accept the comfortable fictions that keep Springfield's population docile and manageable. Her Buddhism should have been the deepening of that conscience. A more rigorous and more ancient framework for the same questions she had been asking since the beginning. The show gave her the framework and then did not use it. In later seasons, Lisa's Buddhism appears when it is convenient for an episode's plot and disappears when it is not. It has become, like the vegetarianism before a certain point in the show's history, a costume element rather than a living part of the character. The version of Lisa's story in which the Buddhist conversion becomes the central fact of her adolescent spiritual development, in which she finds a genuine community of practice, in which her ethical commitments deepen and sharpen, and bring her into increasingly direct conflict with the compromised world she lives in, that story was never told. It was waiting to be told. Every element was in place. The character, the conversion, the community, the spiritual tradition with its own complex relationship to suffering and complicity, and the question of how to live well in an imperfect world. The show had everything it needed to tell the most interesting version of Lisa's story. It chose the background detail instead. Section 8. Cecil Terwilliger, The Brother's Shadow and the Abandoned Dynasty. We visited Cecil briefly in the section about Sideshow Bob. But he deserves his own examination, because the story the show was building around him was distinct from Bob's story even as it was inseparable from it. David Hyde Pierce voiced Cecil, and the casting was so good, so specifically and perfectly calibrated, that it is difficult to watch his episodes without feeling the weight of everything the show could have done with him but did not. Cecil's introduction in Brother from Another Series established him with extraordinary efficiency. His entire character, the specific shape of his resentments, the particular quality of his intelligence, the way he related to Bob, was communicated in 22 minutes with the economy of a writer who knows exactly what they have and exactly how to deploy it. He was the younger brother in the specific sense that matters most in stories about siblings, the one who arrived second and spent his entire life defined by that. He had wanted Bob's career. He had wanted to be the one who stood next to Krusty the Clown on television, not because he particularly wanted to work in children's television, but because he had prepared for it, and Bob had gotten it through a combination of contemptuous accident and Krusty's inability to distinguish disdain from performance. The grievance was small in origin. It is always small in origin. The great, lasting resentments are built from tiny moments of unfairness that nobody noticed at the time. Cecil's response to this grievance was to become methodical. Where Bob was theatrical, explosive, grand in his schemes and grand in his failures, Cecil was precise. Where Bob's plans tended to collapse under the weight of their own ambition, Cecil's plans were designed with an engineer's attention to load-bearing details. The dam embezzlement scheme in Brother from Another series was a perfect expression of this. He did not plot revenge through some elaborate theatrical confrontation. He found a large civic project, positioned himself inside it, and began quietly extracting money from it. He was going to frame Bob for the theft. He was going to destroy his brother's reputation through patient, structural action rather than through passionate confrontation. The episode resolved with Cecil in prison and Bob nominally free, though unable to escape the suspicion that follows him everywhere. And the final image of the two brothers was charged with everything that their relationship contained: the shared intelligence, the shared family, the specific history that made each of them who they were, and the unbridgeable gap between what they could have been together and what they had each become separately. Cecil should have come back. The show had created in Cecil a character who was distinct enough from Bob to tell a different kind of story, while being close enough to Bob to illuminate him in ways that no other character could. The rivalry between the brothers was not simple. It was not just antagonism. It contained genuine love of the kind that exists between siblings who have spent their lives being compared to each other, who know each other with the particular intimacy that only shared origin can produce, and who have spent that intimacy in competition rather than alliance. There were occasional later appearances. Cecil showed up in later seasons briefly, but without the depth of the original episode. The show used him as a convenient plot mechanism without returning to the relationship between the brothers in any serious way. What was quietly canceled was the Terwilliger family as a story. The two brothers, shaped by the same heritage and the same pride, and the same particular brand of intelligence that finds the world perpetually inadequate, but expressed in such completely different directions that they had ended up on opposite sides of every moral and practical question. The show had the opportunity to explore what it meant to be brilliant, and to have that brilliance produce nothing but damage. Bob's brilliance had produced a career as Springfield's most theatrical failed murderer. Cecil's had produced a career as a precisely engineered embezzler. Neither of them had found anything resembling the life that their intelligence suggested should be available to them. That is a story about talent and waste. About what happens to people who are genuinely capable and who find no legitimate channel for that capability. About how intelligence without direction or moral grounding or even basic good fortune can curve back on itself and become a weapon wielded not against the world but against everyone near it. Cecil and Bob could have told that story together. They were perfectly positioned to tell it. The story was not told. Cecil Terwilliger is in a Springfield prison somewhere, presumably. Still precise, still resentful, still carrying the particular quality of his intelligence like a thing he cannot put down and cannot use well. And his brother is somewhere else, still theatrical, still chasing Bart, still failing to become the person that his Italian village briefly allowed him to believe he might actually be. They were never given the conversation that their relationship had been building toward. Section 9. Herb Powell and the Family That Homer Forgot. Season 2 gave us Homer's half-brother in 2 episodes that constitute one of the most complete emotional arcs in the show's early history. Oh Brother, Where Art Thou aired in Season 2. It established that Abe Simpson, before his marriage to Mona, had fathered a child with a carnival worker. That child had been given up for adoption and raised by a different family. He had grown up to become Herbert Powell, the CEO of Powell Motors, one of America's largest automobile manufacturers. He was wealthy, he was successful, he was, by every external measure, everything that Homer was not. And he was desperately lonely. Herb had been looking for his biological family for years. He had the resources to find them. What he found, when he finally located the Simpsons, was Homer, his half-brother. A man who was, by Herb's immediate assessment, exactly the kind of ordinary American that Powell Motors needed to understand in order to survive in a changing automobile market. The first episode of the 2-parter follows Homer's visit to Herb's world, and the disastrous results that follow from giving Homer complete creative control over the design of a new car. The Homer, as the car is named, is everything Homer wants in an automobile and nothing that any other human being could want. It bankrupts Powell Motors. Herb loses everything. And at the end of the episode, Herb looks at Homer with something in his face that goes beyond anger. Something that is grief at the specific cruelty of having found the family you spent your life looking for and having them, through the particular mechanics of who they are, take everything from you anyway. Season 3 brought Brother, Can You Spare Two Dimes, in which Herb returns. He is broke. He is living in a shelter. He is stripped of everything. And he comes to Homer not to recriminate, but because he has an idea and he needs $1,200, and Homer is the only person he can ask. The idea is a baby translation device, a machine that interprets Maggie's sounds into English, identifying what she wants or needs. It works. Herb patents it. The money begins to come in. By the episode's end, Herb is on his way back. He has a future. And he says goodbye to Homer with something that the show earns completely. The two of them standing in the driveway, brothers, having been through what they have been through together, and Herb choosing to leave rather than stay, because he knows that staying in Homer's orbit means risking everything again. He loves Homer. He leaves anyway, because love and proximity are not the same thing, and he has learned this lesson at significant cost. Herb Powell was never seen again. This is one of the more inexplicable narrative decisions in the show's history, because the story that was established across those 2 episodes was not finished. Herb's departure at the end of Brother, Can You Spare Two Dimes, was the end of the immediate crisis. It was not the end of the relationship. 2 brothers who had found each other under extraordinary circumstances, one of them a billionaire turned bankrupt turned recovering entrepreneur, and the other a Homer Simpson, do not simply resolve everything across 2 episodes and move on. The relationship between them had ongoing territory. What did Herb make of his biological father? What did he and Homer actually have in common underneath the enormous practical differences in their lives? What would it mean for Homer to have a brother, a real one, someone who shared his origin in his life? The show established something remarkable with Herb Powell in 2 episodes. A character who was Homer's mirror image, in the sense that mirror images always invert the original. Same origin, completely different outcomes. And the question of what separated them, what choices or accidents of circumstance produced a Homer out of the same raw material that produced a Herb, was never asked directly. That question is genuinely interesting. It points towards something the show rarely examined, which is the question of contingency in Homer's life. Homer ended up in Sector 7G of the Springfield nuclear power plant. Herb ended up running an automobile company. They came from the same place. What made the difference? The show introduced this question and then walked away from it without an answer. What was canceled was the relationship between 2 brothers who were, between them, a complete portrait of the particular mystery of how 2 people, starting from the same point, can end up in such completely different places, and what that journey looks like from both sides. Herb Powell is somewhere out there, still successful, presumably, still carrying the particular quality of loneliness that comes from having built a life without a family, and then having that absence briefly filled and then emptied again. He is waiting for a call that Homer has never made, because Homer forgets, because Homer always forgets, because the accumulated cost of Homer's forgetting is one of the show's longest-running quiet tragedies. Section 10. Springfield's Political World and the Stories That Disappeared. The Simpsons spent a significant portion of its middle seasons building a political landscape for Springfield that was, at various points, genuinely sophisticated in its satirical observation. The town had a functioning political infrastructure. It had factions. It had history. It had characters who were operating within the political machinery with enough complexity to sustain real examination. And the show kept starting storylines within that machinery and not finishing them. Sideshow Bob's mayoral campaign, which we discussed in the section on Bob, was the most complete of these. But it was the first in a series of political stories that the show introduced and never fully developed. Season 4 gave us Marge in Chains, which dealt with the political response to a public health crisis and the way communities respond to fear by finding a scapegoat. The episode is good. It also establishes a Springfield political culture in which misinformation spreads rapidly, in which public trust in institutions is fragile, and in which the community's response to genuine problems is typically a combination of panic and theatrical misdirection. That political culture was a genuine setting. The show had built it carefully across multiple episodes. Mayor Quimby, the Kennedy-inflected corrupt mayor of Springfield, was a fully realized comedic portrait of a specific kind of American political corruption. Not the large-scale systemic kind. The local kind, intimate and personal and specific, the kind where the mayor knows everybody and everybody knows what the mayor is doing, and nobody does anything about it because the economy of favors and mutual benefit that keeps a small city political machine running is too valuable to disrupt. Quimby was comedy, always, but he was comedy built on a recognizable truth. And the show kept finding interesting things to do with him and then abandoning them. There was a storyline developing around Springfield's relationship with its own municipal infrastructure. The monorail episode, Season 4, was part of this. The town's susceptibility to charismatic grifters selling civic dreams. The way public enthusiasm could be manufactured and directed toward projects that serve the interests of the person manufacturing the enthusiasm rather than the community it was ostensibly improving. Springfield was a town that kept being sold things it did not need by people who understood its particular combination of civic pride and institutional naivety. That is a complete political portrait. The show developed it across several seasons and then let it dissipate. The episode Homer the Great introduced the Stonecutters, Springfield's secret society, and with it the suggestion that Springfield's political life was not merely corrupt in the conventional sense, but was organized around invisible hierarchies with their own history and their own mechanisms of social control. The Stonecutters episode is primarily comedy, but the institution it depicts, a private club that controls Springfield's infrastructure, its utilities, its legal system, its media, its educational institutions, is not primarily funny. It is a portrait of how power actually works in small communities. The Stonecutters are the show's acknowledgement that Springfield's government is the visible layer and that the actual decision-making happens elsewhere. This should have been developed. The conflict between the visible political machinery of Mayor Quimby and the invisible machinery of the Stonecutters, the question of who actually runs Springfield and why, the suggestion that the political performances visible to the public are performances rather than governance, all of this was pointed towards something. The something was not written. The show gave us individual episodes dealing with Springfield's political world. The episode dealing with the Bear Patrol. The episode dealing with the monorail. The episode in which Lisa briefly becomes president of Springfield Elementary. The episode in which Quimby's corruption becomes publicly impossible to ignore. Each of these episodes is complete in itself. What was never built was the connective tissue. The ongoing political history of Springfield as a place where specific power structures had specific histories and specific consequences. The show had all the characters necessary to tell that story. It had the satirical angle. It had, in the Stonecutters episode particularly, the suggestion that it understood the difference between the performance of governance and the reality of power. The political story of Springfield was canceled, not all at once, but gradually, as the show stopped treating the town as a place with a coherent political life and started treating the political elements as isolated joke sources. What was lost was the portrait of a small American city navigating the particular corruptions and naiveties and genuine aspirations that characterize American civic life at the local level. The show could have told that story. It had every resource required to tell it. It did not tell it. Section 11. Maggie's intelligence and the promise the show keeps making and not keeping. We touched on Maggie in the section devoted to her silence and her strategic invisibility. But the specific arc of her intelligence across the show's run deserves its own treatment, because it is one of the most sustained and most deliberately teased abandoned storylines in the series. The show has been gesturing toward Maggie as extraordinarily gifted since the beginning. Her IQ, when tested, registers as exceptional. The specific number varies by episode and by how much the show wants to commit to it in any given moment, but the implication is consistent. Maggie is measuring somewhere well above the norm, possibly off the charts in conventional terms. This has been established multiple times, in multiple contexts, by multiple different characters. Her problem-solving abilities are documented across numerous episodes. The Longest Daycare short film gave us the most sustained portrait of Maggie's cognitive ability, working at full stretch, planning and executing a multi-stage rescue operation with the kind of adaptive intelligence that most adults struggle to demonstrate under pressure. The Muppet Babies-esque sequences in earlier seasons, in which the children's imaginative play was depicted with full animated sequences, showed Maggie as the organizing intelligence of the group's shared fantasy world. While Bart led through force of personality and Lisa led through analysis, Maggie directed through something harder to name, a spatial awareness and a situational understanding that operated faster than articulation. And the shooting of Mr. Burns, whatever the full truth of that episode, established Maggie as someone capable of taking significant action in the world with total calm and total comprehension of what she was doing. The show has been building towards something with Maggie for 36 years. It has not arrived. The specific story that keeps being suggested and keeps being deferred is the story of Maggie growing into her intelligence and beginning to actively shape the world around her. Not as a baby incidentally doing remarkable things. As a person who has decided to use what she has, the show has given us glimpses of what this might look like. There are future set episodes in which Maggie appears as an adult. She varies between these depictions. Sometimes she is a virtuoso musician. Sometimes she is a political figure. Sometimes she is simply present, a Maggie-shaped adult presence in a future Springfield, which may tell you less about who she becomes than about the show's reluctance to commit to a single version of her. The most interesting future glimpse is from a Treehouse of Horror segment, in which a future version of Maggie is depicted as a terrifying genius who has finally decided to act, and the action is not gentle. This is the darkest version of where her particular combination of extraordinary intelligence and extended strategic silence might lead. A mind that has been watching and waiting for decades finally deciding that the waiting is finished. The show presents this as horror comedy. But there is something in it that resonates with the logic of what the show has been establishing about Maggie for its entire run. If you have observed something with total clarity for your entire life, if you have watched your family and your town and understood them more completely than any of them understand themselves, if you have been sitting with that understanding in silence for decades and the world has not changed, what do you do with all of that? The show keeps asking this question and declining to answer it. Every time Maggie demonstrates something extraordinary, the show moves on. Every time the suggestion of her extraordinary capacity is introduced, it is resolved within the episode and forgotten. Every time the show approaches the question of what Maggie is building toward in her silence, it backs away. What was quietly canceled over and over again across 36 years of careful setup is the story of Maggie's arrival. The moment when she stops being the background intelligence of the Simpson household and becomes the primary actor, the show has earned that story. It has laid every piece of evidence required to tell it. It has given Maggie the intelligence, the patience, the situational awareness, the particular quality of having watched everything without participating in anything. It has given her every quality that a character needs to finally step forward. And every time the step seems imminent, the episode ends, the credits roll, and Maggie is back in her high chair with her pacifier, watching, still waiting, still planning. The story of what she is planning was quietly canceled so many times that the cancellation has become its own kind of story. The promise made and not kept, made and not kept, made and not kept, across 3.5 decades of Springfield's permanent present. Maggie Simpson is 1 year old. She has been 1 year old for 36 years, and somewhere inside that frozen infancy, something remarkable is thinking thoughts that nobody in Springfield is ready to hear. The show knows this. It keeps not telling us. Section 12. The financial ruin that always repairs itself. The Simpson family has been bankrupt, effectively, many times. Homer has lost the house. Homer has accumulated debts that, by any realistic accounting, would take multiple lifetimes to repay. The family has been on the edge of genuine material catastrophe in ways that the show depicts with enough specificity to be alarming if you stop to think about them. And every time, by the following episode, the financial situation has been restored to its default condition without explanation or consequence. This is the most structurally fundamental of the show's canceled storylines, because it is not a single arc that was begun and abandoned. It is a recurring pattern of arcs, each one beginning with genuine material crisis, and each one ending with a reset that the show does not explain, because explaining it would require the show to acknowledge something it prefers to ignore. Let us trace this carefully. Homer Simpson is a safety inspector at the Springfield nuclear power plant. His salary has been discussed and depicted across multiple episodes. It is not large, It is the salary of a working-class man in a mid-size American city, slightly above median in some episodes, slightly below in others. The Simpson house at 742 Evergreen Terrace is a four-bedroom home, apparently owned, in a residential neighborhood. The family has two cars. They eat regularly. The children participate in activities. Marge does not work outside the home for most of the show's run. The arithmetic of this life, examined honestly, does not add up. The show knows it does not add up. Several episodes are built around the gap between what Homer earns and what the family's life requires. Season 2 gave us Bart gets hit by a car, in which the family's financial fragility is used as the premise of a legal case. Season 5 gave us Homer and Apu, which examined economic anxiety at the quick E-Mart level. Season 8 gave us Homer versus the 18th Amendment, which was partly about economic desperation. And across a dozen other episodes, Homer's salary and the family's financial situation were presented as a genuine, ongoing source of stress. Then there is the matter of Homer's various business ventures. Homer has started, and failed at, a remarkable number of businesses. He has been a food truck operator, a bodyguard, a baby proofer, an internet entrepreneur during the dot-com bubble, a snow plowing service operator, and a grease trader, among many other endeavors. Several of these ventures ended in financial disaster. Several of them ended with Homer owing money to people or institutions that the show presents as genuinely threatening. The financial damage from each of these ventures should have been cumulative. A family on Homer's salary who has experienced multiple business failures, multiple unexpected medical expenses, multiple incidents of property damage, and multiple instances of Homer spending money on impulse that the family does not have, should be in a state of genuine material crisis. The show occasionally depicts this crisis clearly and seriously. Then it resets. What was canceled over and over was the storyline of what Homer's financial improvidence actually cost his family in the long run, because the long run never arrives in Springfield. The Simpson house should have been lost to the bank seasons ago if the family's finances were tracked honestly. Homer's credit should be a ruin. The family should have been making decisions about what they can and cannot afford for decades, and those decisions should have accumulated into a portrait of working-class economic life that was both comedically rich and genuinely true to the experience of millions of people watching. The show has the material. It has Homer's salary, which is real and documented. It has the family's expenses, which are real and depicted. It has the gap between them, which is real and sometimes acknowledged. What it does not have is the courage to follow that gap to its natural conclusion, because following it would mean the Simpson family losing the house on Evergreen Terrace. Following it would mean Bart and Lisa changing schools. Following it would mean Marge going back to work and the specific texture of the family's daily life changing in ways that could not be reset by the following episode. The financial ruin of the Simpson family is the show's most consistently teased and most consistently canceled storyline. It is the story that exists most obviously in the gap between the life the show depicts and the material conditions that life would require. Every time the show approaches it, it produces an episode of genuine economic anxiety and then resolves it with the next episode's reset. The reset is not explained. The money never adds up. The house is always there. And the story of what it actually costs a working-class American family to sustain the life they believe they are supposed to live, that story sits permanently unfinished in the space between every episode about Homer's latest financial disaster and the next episode in which the disaster has been quietly absorbed back into the default condition. The default condition is not a happy ending. It is a suspended question. A family balancing on a financial edge that should have given way decades ago, kept aloft by the show's unwillingness to ask what happens when the balance finally fails. Conclusion. What the quiet cancellations tell us about Springfield? We have spent several hours in Springfield tonight, moving slowly through the stories that were started and not finished, the threads that were introduced with genuine care and genuine intention, and then quietly folded away. Sideshow Bob's redemption in the Italian village that was taken from him. Apu's rich backstory folded into the background, Troy McClure's secret and the story that would have told it. Marge's gambling addiction acknowledged once and then forgotten. Bart and Greta Wolfcastle's tender, incomplete connection, the long, unsaid thing between Smithers and Burns. Lisa's Buddhism and the spiritual life it implied. Cecil Terwilliger and the Terwilliger family's complete story. Herb Powell and the brother Homer forgot. Springfield's political world and the stories it contained, Maggie's intelligence and the moment that keeps not arriving, the financial ruin that always heals without explanation. 12 stories, 12 threads that were carefully begun and quietly canceled. And sitting here at the end, with Springfield behind us and the night still dark outside, what do all of them have in common? They are all stories about consequences. Every canceled storyline in The Simpsons follows the same pattern. The show introduces a genuine consequence of the character's circumstances and then finds a way to absorb it back into the permanent present. Marge's addiction has consequences for her family. Bob's attempt at redemption has consequences for who he can become. Homer's financial decisions have consequences for the house on Evergreen Terrace. Maggie's intelligence has consequences for the balance of the Simpson family. Smithers's feelings have consequences for the central relationship in his life. Consequences require time to play out. They require the characters to carry something forward from one episode to the next. They require the show to acknowledge that what happened last week still matters this week, that the weight of accumulated choices and events presses on people and shapes who they become. Springfield's permanent present tense cannot accommodate true consequences. The town is built to prevent them. The reset after each episode is not merely a narrative device. It is the mechanism by which Springfield maintains itself against the natural pressure of time and cause and effect. The canceled storylines are the places where the show felt that pressure most acutely. The places where the story being told was pulling so hard toward a real conclusion that the only way to maintain the permanent present was to quietly stop telling it. Every abandoned arc is a story that was too true to the actual mechanics of human life for the show's eternal present to contain. Sideshow Bob really did find something worth keeping in that Italian village. That is true. That is the real shape of his journey, and it points toward a real ending that the permanent present cannot allow. Marge really did sit at that slot machine while Maggie cried. That is true. That is the real shape of Marge's inner life, and it points toward a real examination of what lies underneath her composure that the permanent present cannot allow. Maggie really is extraordinary. That is true. That is the real shape of who she is, and it points toward a real emergence that the permanent present cannot allow. The permanent present keeps them frozen. Bart stays 10, Lisa stays 8. Homer comes home from work and the house is always there and the beer is always cold and nothing has changed. And in the space between what the show established and what it was willing to follow through on, in the quiet where the canceled storylines live, you can hear the faint echo of all the stories that were almost told. They are good stories. Some of them are extraordinary stories. They are still waiting, somewhere in Springfield, in the perpetual amber of a town that decided a long time ago that the only futures worth having are the ones you can cancel before they become real. The night is getting late. Springfield is quiet at this hour. The Quickie Mart is still lit from within, its fluorescent glow spilling onto the sidewalk, because the Quickie Mart is always open, always bright, always there. The Simpsons house at 742 Evergreen Terrace has its lights off. Everyone is asleep. Somewhere in that sleeping house, Maggie is watching the ceiling. Somewhere in a Springfield prison, Cecil Terwilliger is thinking something precise. Somewhere in Italy, a small Tuscan village has a house that stood empty after its family left in a hurry, and the neighbors know not to ask why. Somewhere between all of these, the canceled stories breathe quietly, waiting for the show to remember them. It probably won't, but they are still there. They were always there. And now, so are you. Sleep well. Springfield will be here when you wake up. It always is. Thank you for spending this time in Springfield. If this helped you drift off, or if you made it all the way through, subscribe and leave a comment with where you are in the world. These quiet journeys are better with company. Extended section, the characters who should have come back. There is a category adjacent to the canceled storylines, sitting just to one side of the stories that were started and abandoned. This category belongs to the characters who appeared with enough substance to suggest they were the beginning of something and then did not come back. The Simpsons created, across its run, a remarkable number of guest and supporting characters who were developed with a specificity that went far beyond what a single episode appearance required. These were characters whose episodes contained the implicit promise that they were establishing something that would continue. Some of them did come back, briefly, in diminished form. Most of them simply did not return. Let us walk through a few. Frank Grimes, the most famous of this category, is a special case. He appeared in Season 8's Homer's Enemy and died in that same episode, so his absence in subsequent episodes is literally explained. But the idea he represented, the idea of a person who lives by the rules that Homer perpetually violates and who finds Homer's immunity to consequences genuinely maddening, was so rich and so clearly resonant that his death felt like the show cutting off an important line of inquiry prematurely. Grimes's son appeared in a later episode, briefly, as a way of revisiting the theme. But the theme itself, what it says about a universe that rewards Homer Simpson and punishes Frank Grimes, was explored in a single episode and closed. More interesting, and less often discussed, is the story of Mindy Simmons. Season 5 gave us The Last Temptation of Homer, in which Homer meets a new coworker named Mindy who is, in all the ways that matter to Homer, his perfect counterpart. She loves donuts. She falls asleep in inappropriate situations. She is, by the episode's own logic, Homer's soulmate in everything except the fact that she is not Marge. The episode handles the temptation with genuine seriousness. Homer is attracted to Mindy. Mindy is attracted to Homer. The episode does not play this as simple comedy. It follows the emotional logic of genuine marital temptation, the specific feeling of finding someone who understands you in a particular way, and the specific cost of choosing not to act on that understanding. Homer ultimately chooses Marge, not because Mindy is not wonderful, because Marge is his wife and his family, and the life they have built together is the thing he would destroy by acting on what he feels. The episode ends, Mindy does not appear again. What was canceled was not the temptation itself, which the episode resolved clearly and genuinely. What was canceled was the aftermath. Homer found someone who understood him in a specific way that Marge does not, or cannot, or has not had the occasion to. That person is somewhere in Springfield, working at the same nuclear power plant, navigating the same corridors, in all probability still seeing Homer at intervals. What does Homer do with that? What does Marge know, or suspect, or choose not to know? What does it mean to choose your marriage and still carry the knowledge of what you chose it over? The show asked this question beautifully in The Last Temptation of Homer, and then declined to follow it. Mindy Simmons was never seen again. There is also the matter of Danny DeVito's character, Herb Powell, which we discussed, and the matter of John Lovitz's Artie Ziff, who appeared in Homer's early memories as Marge's high school boyfriend and occasional subsequent visitor to Springfield. Ziff is an interesting case, because the show did return to him across several episodes, but never developed the implicit story of what his continued feelings for Marge meant for the Simpson marriage in any sustained way. Each Ziff episode was self-contained. The accumulated weight of the character's history with the Simpson family was never used as the engine of a longer story. There is Patrick Parson, voiced by Albert Brooks, who appeared as the obsessive writer in Season 3 and whose specific brand of creative terror was rich enough to sustain many more episodes. There is Hank Scorpio, the charismatic supervillain employer of Season 8, whose genuine paternal warmth toward Homer and whose completely sincere megalomania represented one of the funniest and most unexplored character combinations the show ever created. There is Rachel Jordan, the Christian rock musician who briefly captured Ned Flanders' heart in a Season 9 episode and then quietly disappeared from Springfield and from Ned's life without anything approaching a real resolution. Each of these characters was not just a guest appearance. Each was a door that the show opened with enough care to suggest it intended to go through it and then gently shut. The doors are still there. The characters are still, by the show's own logic, somewhere in Springfield, living their lives in the permanent present that the show maintains. The stories they were supposed to tell are living in the same permanent present. Never started, never finished. Suspended in the amber of a show that keeps building rooms it never enters. Extended section. The Homer and Marge marriage arcs that were never resolved. The Simpson marriage has been in genuine crisis more times than most fictional marriages survive. This is not an exaggeration or a matter of interpretation. The show explicitly depicted Homer and Marge's marriage as being under serious threat in multiple separate storylines, some of which were resolved clearly within their episode, and some of which were not resolved at all, but simply allowed to dissipate without acknowledgement. Let us look at the ones that were quietly abandoned. The agoraphobia storyline in Season 9 gave us Marge Simpson in Screaming Yellow Honkers, in which Marge develops a road rage problem and briefly loses her license. But the episode that is more interesting for our purposes is Fear of Flying in Season 6, in which Marge is revealed to have a deep fear of flying that is connected to repressed childhood memories of her father. The memories, when they are finally accessed in therapy, involve her father's career as a flight attendant and the specific humiliation he suffered in that role. The episode is unusually interested in Marge's psychology and unusually willing to follow the threads of that psychology into genuinely dark territory. But the therapy scenes end before they reach anything definitive. Marge confronts her fear. The episode resolves. The underlying material about her father and her family history, the stuff that was genuinely interesting, is left without real examination. A later episode eventually addressed Marge's father more directly, but the connection between Marge's family history, her tendency to absorb pressure rather than express it, her gambling addiction, her occasional breakdowns, was never assembled into a coherent picture. The show had all the pieces. It had the fear of flying, the gambling, the agoraphobia, the episode where she becomes so physically strong that she develops a rage problem, the episode where she becomes addicted to painkillers, the episodes where her patience with Homer reaches visible limits and the marriage shows genuine fractures. Each of these was a piece of a larger story about who Marge Simpson is underneath the composure. Each of them was also allowed to exist in isolation, self-contained, unconnected to the others. The larger story was never assembled from the pieces. The version of Marge's story in which all these isolated episodes are understood as symptoms of the same underlying reality, a woman under sustained pressure who has been absorbing the weight of her family's chaos for decades and who has specific vulnerabilities and specific breaking points, was quietly canceled across 36 seasons by the show's preference for isolated episode arcs over sustained character development. The marriage itself shows the same pattern. The show has given Homer and Marge genuine marital crises. The episode where Homer is briefly attracted to Mindy. The episode where Marge briefly reconnects with her high school boyfriend Artie Ziff. The episodes where Homer's various enthusiasms crowd Marge out of his attention for extended periods, and she finds herself quietly invisible in her own family. In a real marriage, these events would leave marks. They would accumulate into a history. They would produce conversations that referenced what had happened before. They would change the way the two people related to each other in ways that were visible and lasting. In the Simpson marriage, they reset. The most interesting version of Homer and Marge's marriage is the one that would be visible if you stacked all the episodes of genuine marital difficulty on top of each other and looked at what they added up to. What they add up to is a portrait of two people who are genuinely in love and who have spent 36 years finding ways not to have the honest conversations their relationship requires. Not because they are dishonest people, but because the life they are living and the particular habits and limitations they each carry make those conversations consistently difficult to begin and consistently easy to defer. That portrait is right there in the episodes. The pieces are all present. The show just never assembled them into a picture. Extended section. Ned Flanders and the faith that should have been tested. We discussed Ned briefly in the reference transcript, and the treatment there captured something true about the character. But the abandoned storyline in Ned's case is specific enough to warrant extended examination. Ned Flanders is, by the logic of the show's universe, a genuinely pious man living in a town where God apparently speaks to Homer Simpson, and not to the devout Christian who has dedicated his life to his faith. This is not a detail in the background. It is a structural feature of Springfield's spiritual landscape that the show established and then declined to examine. God, in the Simpsons universe, is a canonical presence. He has spoken to Homer. He has appeared to Homer. Homer and God have had genuine theological exchanges across multiple episodes. Homer is, in the show's cosmology, someone to whom the divine is apparently accessible despite being someone who, by every conventional religious measure, would not be first in line for divine communication. Ned prays constantly. Ned attends church every week without fail. Ned lives by his faith in a way that is, within the show, depicted as absolutely genuine and not ironic. Ned actually believes. The belief is real, and God has never spoken to Ned. The show has acknowledged this asymmetry. Ned has noticed, at various points, that the universe seems to operate in a way that is indifferent to his moral effort. His wife died, his house was destroyed, his children are occasionally endangered. His neighbor is Homer. The question this creates, within Ned's specific psychology and spiritual framework, is the question of why. Why does a man who has given his life to his faith receive silence from the divine, while a man who has done nothing to merit divine attention receives apparently regular communication? That is a genuinely profound theological question. The show knows it is a profound theological question. The show periodically deploys it for dark comedy. What the show never did was follow it to its natural conclusion. The natural conclusion is a crisis of faith, not a comic crisis resolved within 22 minutes. A real one. The kind that comes from sustained honest engagement with the possibility that the framework you have organized your life around may not operate the way you have always believed it does. Ned Flanders having a genuine, sustained crisis of faith, triggered by the accumulated evidence that the universe does not reward righteousness and does not answer prayer and does not operate according to any of the principles he has built his life around, would be one of the most interesting stories the show could tell. It would not be comfortable. It would not be resolvable within a single episode. It would require Ned to walk through something that his programming, his conditioning, his behavioral modification, his entire identity has been constructed to prevent him from approaching. The show tried something like this in the hurricane episode, and what emerged from Ned's breakdown was the revelation about his childhood conditioning, which is a piece of the same story. But the episode resolved Ned's breakdown through therapy rather than through any genuine engagement with the theological questions his breakdown raised. The version of Ned's story, in which his faith is seriously tested by the accumulated evidence of his own life, and in which he either emerges from that testing with a deeper and more complex faith, or does not emerge with his faith intact at all, was never told. Season 19 gave us a brief arc in which Ned falls in love with Edna Krabappel. They get married. It is unexpectedly warm. Ned has found a second person to love, and the show allowed this relationship to develop with more care than it usually extended to Ned's personal life. And then Marcia Wallace, who voiced Edna, died in 2013, and Edna was quietly retired in the same gesture of respect with which Troy McClure and Lionel Hutz had been retired after Phil Hartman's death, and Ned was alone again. There is something about this pattern, the show giving Ned something real and then having it taken from him, that feels almost too on the nose as an expression of the theological question his character embodies. Why does the devout man keep losing the things he loves? The show does not answer this question. It just keeps asking it with his life. The story of what Ned does with that question, of what a person of genuine faith does when the evidence of their own experience challenges that faith, was quietly canceled across 36 years of episodes that gave Ned grief and loneliness and the specific exhaustion of performing goodness in a universe that does not appear to notice. What was canceled was the reckoning. Ned Flanders has earned a reckoning with the theological reality of his life. The show has provided all the material. It has taken his wife. It has destroyed his house. It has given him Homer as a neighbor. It has made him watch, for 3 decades, as God apparently speaks regularly to a man who once fell asleep in church and caused a small nuclear incident. The reckoning has not come. It is waiting somewhere in Springfield, in the quiet of the Flanders house after the children are asleep and the Bible is open on the kitchen table and Ned is sitting with the silence that answers him every time he prays. Extended section. The children who were supposed to grow up. This is the central impossibility of the show, and it has been discussed, but it deserves one more pass from a different angle. The Simpsons children were, in the show's early seasons, depicted with a specificity that implied futures. Bart was 10 and was failing school and was causing chaos, but the chaos had a quality of something that would either transform into something dangerous or something creative, depending on which way the pressure of his life pushed him. Lisa was 8 and was already marked by the particular isolation of exceptional intelligence in an environment that does not reward it. Maggie was 1 and was extraordinary in ways that nobody was paying attention to. These were not character snapshots. They were character beginnings. The show was establishing who these children were at a particular moment in their development as the foundation for a story about who they would become. The most complete version of this was in the Lisa's wedding flash-forward episode. which is set approximately 15 years in the future and depicts Lisa as a 23-year-old graduate student at a British university, engaged to a man named Hugh, navigating the specific tensions of having grown up in Springfield and having escaped it and still being connected to it by the family she left behind. The episode is extraordinary. It is one of the best episodes in the show's entire run precisely because it commits to the premise that time has passed, that the children have grown, that Springfield has changed and not changed, and that the Simpson family carries everything it was in the early seasons forward into a future that is recognizably continuous with its past. Lisa in that episode is not a different character from the Lisa we know. She is the same character, moved forward through time by the specific pressures that her character has been subject to. She is more confident in some ways and more guarded in others. She is professionally successful and personally lonely in exactly the ways that her early characterization suggested she would be. She still loves her family deeply and finds them painful in the specific ways that highly capable people find their families of origin painful. It is the most honest portrait the show ever drew of who its characters might become if allowed to become anything at all. And then the episode ended, and Lisa was 8 years old again. The version of the show that honored what Lisa's wedding implied was the version that aged the children. That allowed Bart to graduate from elementary school. That allowed Lisa to enter junior high. That allowed Maggie to learn to speak and walk and begin the particular journey that her extraordinary intelligence implies. That version of the show was quietly canceled not once but continuously, with every episode that chose to maintain the floating timeline rather than acknowledge the passage of time. The specific canceled story of each child is worth naming. Bart was going to grow up and be someone. The show gestures at various possible futures for him. The criminal path, suggested by his natural talents for deception and manipulation. The artistic path, suggested by his creativity and his intuitive understanding of how to capture an audience's attention. The path of someone who finds the right outlet and surprises everyone, including himself. The show never chose between these possibilities because choosing would require acknowledging that time has passed and Bart is not 10 anymore. Lisa was going to be extraordinary in the world outside Springfield. The show establishes this so often and so clearly that it borders on tragic. She is going to leave. She is going to do something significant. The specific shape of that something is left deliberately open, but the movement away from Springfield and toward a larger world is the fundamental implied direction of her character. The show never let her take that direction. She remains in Springfield, 8 years old, still fighting the same battles against the same institutional indifference. Maggie was going to speak. The show has promised this so many times in so many ways that the continued deferral of Maggie's full arrival into language and action has become one of Springfield's most sustained mysteries. She is still waiting. The children's futures were quietly canceled decades ago and have been canceled again in every episode since. What remains is the permanent present. The show will not end. The children will not age. The futures implied by everything the show established about them in its first decade will remain permanently deferred. The timer on Maggie's first real word has been running for 36 years. The clock on Bart's arrival at something real has been running for 36 years. The story of Lisa's departure from Springfield and what she becomes after it has been running for 36 years. None of them have finished yet. And in the quiet of Springfield tonight, with the lights off in the house on Evergreen Terrace and the neighborhood still, and the nuclear plant's cooling towers visible against the dark sky, you can almost hear them ticking. Almost. Sleep now. The stories will be here in the morning. So will Springfield. So will the children. Still the same ages they were when the show began, still carrying the weight of all the futures they were built to inhabit and have never been allowed to reach. Somewhere between all of it, between the canceled arcs and the abandoned threads and the characters who were given beginnings without endings, Springfield breathes. It breathes very slowly. And every breath contains a story that was never finished. That is what makes it Springfield. That is why we keep going back. Good night. If you made it this far, you are either asleep, which is the goal, or genuinely devoted to Springfield, which is equally valid. Subscribe, leave a comment with your location and the time, and come back soon. There are more quiet roads in Springfield than we have walked tonight, and the show is not done building them. The show has been building toward Maggie's first real word, her first real sentence, her first real entrance into language and the human world that language opens for her entire existence on screen. The show has built toward it so deliberately and so consistently that the deferral has become its own kind of statement. But the statement the deferral makes, if it is a deliberate artistic choice, is less interesting than the arrival would be. The arrival is still pending. The children's futures were quietly canceled decades ago, and they have been canceled again in every episode since. The timer on each of their stories has been running for 36 years without reaching zero. Extended section. The Homer and Marge stories that were never told. The Simpson marriage has been in genuine crisis more times than most fictional marriages survive, and the show has, in each case, chosen resolution over examination. This is a pattern worth tracing slowly, because the cumulative effect of all those individual resolutions is a marriage that appears episode by episode to work itself through various difficulties, but which has actually been accumulating a history of near misses and unaddressed pressures that the permanent present tense has never required it to reckon with. The agoraphobia storyline in Season 6, from the episode Fear of Flying, is one of the show's more careful examinations of Marge's psychology. She is afraid of flying. This fear is connected to something in her childhood, something involving her father, something that the episode is unusually willing to follow into genuinely dark territory. The therapy scenes in the episode are thoughtful. They go further into Marge's history than the show usually goes, establishing a relationship between her present anxiety and her past experience that was clearly intended to be developed further. But the therapy scenes end before reaching anything fully articulated. Marge confronts her fear. The episode resolves. The underlying material about her father and her early family life, the stuff that was genuinely interesting and genuinely in progress, is left unexamined. What was being built across the fear of flying storyline and the gambling addiction and the various other episodes that opened windows into Marge's inner life was a portrait of someone with a specific psychology that had been formed by specific experiences and that showed itself under specific kinds of pressure. The composure she presents to the world is not a natural condition. It is something she maintains, something she works at, something that has costs and vulnerabilities that the show periodically glimpsed and then looked away from. The version of Marge's story in which all these isolated glimpses are assembled into a coherent picture was never told. The show preferred the composure to the thing underneath it, preferred the patient Marge who manages the household to the Marge who is sitting at a slot machine while Maggie cries. There is also the matter of Homer and Marge's various romantic crises. The Last Temptation of Homer, in Season 5, followed Homer's experience of genuine attraction to a coworker named Mindy Simmons. The episode handled this with a seriousness the premise might not have required. It followed the emotional logic of marital temptation with uncommon honesty for a primetime animated comedy. The specific experience of finding someone who understands you in a particular way that your spouse does not or cannot, and the specific cost of choosing not to act on that understanding. Homer chose Marge. The choice was genuine and clearly made. But the episode established something that did not simply resolve with the choice. He had found someone who understood him in a way that was real, and that reality did not cease to exist because Homer chose not to act on it. Mindy was at work. She shared his daily context. She found the same daily absurdities funny. She understood the specific texture of his mind in a way that Marge, who loved him deeply and who knew him far better in other dimensions, did not share. What that means for the marriage, for how Homer navigates a working environment that includes someone he was genuinely drawn to, for what Marge knows or suspects or chooses not to know, was never explored. Mindy Simmons was never seen again after her introductory episode. There was also the recurring presence of Artie Ziff, Marge's high school boyfriend. Artie had been established in a flashback episode as someone who had understood Marge in certain ways, and who had failed to hold her precisely because he could not offer her what Homer did. The later Artie episodes played the dynamic for comedy but also carried the genuine weight of two people navigating a shared history and deciding what it means for the present. Those episodes were self-contained. The accumulated weight of Artie's history with Marge, the ongoing question of what it means for the Simpson marriage that Marge had a genuine other person in her past who still carries real feeling for her, was never used as the engine of a sustained examination. The version of Homer and Marge's marriage that was quietly canceled across 36 years is the version in which the accumulated history of what has happened between them The near misses and the genuine crises and the conversations that were had and the conversations that were not becomes the actual subject of the show. The version in which the marriage is treated as a dynamic, ongoing thing shaped by everything that has happened in it, rather than as a permanent condition that resets to its default state between episodes. That version would have required the show to treat Homer and Marge as people with histories rather than characters with premises. It would have required the permanent present to give way, even slightly, to the accumulated past. The permanent present held. It always holds. Extended section. The Skinner-Chalmers dynamic and what was never examined. Principal Seymour Skinner and Superintendent Chalmers share one of the most precisely observed comedic relationships in the show's entire run. And that relationship was given depth across many seasons without the show ever fully following through on what it had established. The dynamic is familiar to anyone who has watched the show's middle seasons. Chalmers arrives at Springfield Elementary in a state of barely contained frustration. Skinner attempts to manage the visit. Everything goes wrong. Chalmers' anger builds. Skinner improvises explanations for the various disasters that occur around him, with the specific creativity of someone who has been doing this so long that the improvisation is no longer remarkable to him. And then Chalmers departs, somewhat appeased but not entirely, and the process resets for the next visit. This is comedy. It is very good comedy. The specificity of the relationship, the particular quality of Chalmers' exasperation and Skinner's controlled desperation, was constructed across so many episodes that it constituted one of the show's most consistent, ongoing comedic premises. But underneath the comedy, the show had established something more interesting. Skinner, revealed in the later Armin Tamzarian episode to not be who he says he is, had been running Springfield Elementary for 2 decades inside a stolen identity. He had, by any honest accounting, been doing a reasonable job. The school was a disaster in the ways that underfunded schools in economically depressed communities are always disasters, not because of administrative failure but because of structural neglect. And within those constraints, Skinner had been a genuine presence. He had cared about the school in ways that his military bearing and his particular quality of compressed anxiety made visible rather than concealing. Chalmers, across the same period, had been his evaluator, the person who was supposed to hold him accountable for the school's performance. And what the show established across all those visit episodes was that Chalmers knew more than he let on. He was not simply fooled by Skinner's improvised explanations. He was, in a way, the show made visible through small accumulated details, choosing to accept those explanations because the alternative, replacing Skinner, would have required actual administrative action and actual institutional investment that neither Chalmers nor the Springfield School District behind him was prepared to provide. The Chalmers-Skinner dynamic was the show's most sustained portrait of institutional complicity at the local level. 2 people in a hierarchical relationship both understanding, without ever saying directly, that the system they are operating within is not capable of producing the outcomes it claims to be aimed at, and both making the daily choice to continue operating within it anyway. That is not simply comedy. That is a portrait of how institutions actually function when the gap between their stated purposes and their actual capacities becomes permanent. The show never examined this directly. It used the dynamic for comedy across dozens of episodes and never stepped back to look at what it had assembled. The picture that the accumulated episodes painted was right there, visible in the pattern of the visits and the quality of Chalmers' exasperation and Skinner's improvisations. But the show never made it explicit, never followed the logic of the dynamic to whatever conclusion it was pointing at. What was canceled was the serious version of the Skinner-Chalmers story. The version in which 2 people trapped in a system that cannot deliver what it promises eventually have an honest conversation about what they are each doing and why. That conversation was never written. Extended section. The recurring guest characters who deserved continuations. The Simpsons created, across its run, a remarkable number of guest and supporting characters developed with a specificity that went far beyond what a single episode appearance required. Characters whose episodes contained the implicit promise that they were establishing something that would continue, most of them simply did not return. Albert Brooks appeared as Brad Goodman in Season 5, playing a self-help guru who descends on Springfield with the particular charisma of someone who has discovered that telling people exactly what they want to hear is an infinitely scalable business model. The episode, Bart's Dog Gets an F, was primarily about Brad's influence on the town, and specifically on Homer. But what made Brad interesting was the small, carefully placed suggestion that his certainty about his own methods was itself a kind of performance, that there was a different person underneath the confident broadcast persona who was considerably less certain about everything than the television version suggested. That suggestion was never developed. Brad Goodman appeared once and left Springfield without anyone examining what was underneath the performance. John Lovitz appeared in multiple capacities across the show's run, most notably as Artie Ziff, Marge's high school boyfriend, and as Jay Sherman, the pompous television critic. But the most interesting guest character Lovitz contributed was Artie, and Artie's recurring story, as we discussed, was never fully developed into the examination of a man who has spent his adult life measuring himself against the husband that the woman he loved chose instead of him. That is a story with genuine psychological territory in it. The show kept approaching it and kept pulling back. Hank Scorpio, played by Albert Brooks in the Season 8 episode You Only Move Twice, remains one of the most beloved single-appearance characters in the show's history. He was a supervillain employer, running an organization that was in the process of taking over the world, with the particular quality of someone who genuinely enjoyed what he did and genuinely cared about the people who worked for him. He remembered Homer's name. He asked about Homer's family. He gave Homer supportive feedback on his professional performance. He treated Homer, in other words, with more consistent human decency than Charles Montgomery Burns had managed across Homer's entire career. The episode ended with the world domination plot partially succeeding and Homer returning to Springfield with a football team instead of the Denver Broncos because Scorpio had given him the wrong Denver franchise. It was one of the most perfectly constructed comedy conclusions the show ever produced, and Hank Scorpio was never seen again. The specific story that was being implied by his relationship with Homer, the comparison between a supervillain employer who treated Homer as a full human being and a legitimate employer who could not remember his name, was a story worth telling. The question of what it says about the concept of villainy that the most decent professional relationship Homer ever had was with a man engaged in the actual takeover of the world was a genuinely interesting question. The show asked it once, in 22 minutes, and left it there. There is also the matter of Sideshow Mel, who exists in the show's universe as Krusty's replacement sidekick after Bob's imprisonment. Mel was given periodic episodes that tried to develop him as a character distinct from simply Bob's replacement, and those episodes suggested someone with his own specific history and his own particular quality of theatrical dignity that was in some ways a more benign mirror of Bob's own presentation. The show never committed to Mel as a full character. He remained in the permanent second tier of Springfield's supporting players, occasionally used when the plot required a Krusty-adjacent presence but never examined as a person with his own story worth following. What all these characters share is the quality of having been built with more intention than a single episode requires. The writers gave them depth that could only have been justified by the assumption that the depth would be used in subsequent appearances, that the establishing work would pay off. In each case, the subsequent appearances did not come, or came in diminished form, without the depth of the original, or came so briefly that the accumulated weight of the character's history was simply not acknowledged. The show built rooms it did not enter, over and over, with care and skill and clear intentionality, and then left the doors closed. Extended section, Lisa and the Question, of leaving Springfield. The show has been pointing at Lisa's departure from Springfield since approximately the middle of its third season, and the pointing has never stopped. Every season that has followed has added more evidence that Lisa Simpson does not belong in Springfield. Not in the way that misfits sometimes belong to their misfit towns, finding in the specific shape of their alienation a community they could not have found elsewhere. Lisa belongs nowhere near Springfield. She never has. And the show has been honest about this while being unable to actually follow the logic of its honesty. Consider the weight of what the show has established about Lisa's relationship to her hometown. She is the smartest person in the school. She is probably the smartest person in the town, with exceptions made for a handful of supporting characters who are deployed in their episodes for their specific competences and who are otherwise kept at the margins. She is musically gifted at a level that her elementary school cannot meaningfully support. She has an ethical framework that is more developed, more consistently applied, and more willing to accept the costs of its own application than the framework of any adult she knows. She has been reading at a postgraduate level since she was 8 years old. She has been thinking about the world with a precision and a willingness to sit with complexity that is, within the show's Springfield, genuinely rare, and she is still there. Every year, every episode. Still 8 years old. Still in Springfield Elementary. Still surrounded by people whose capacity to engage with what she actually is runs from indifference to active hostility, with occasional stops at well-meaning incomprehension. The show knows what it is doing. The tension between who Lisa is and where Lisa is has been one of the primary dramatic engines of her character since the beginning. The specific quality of her suffering in Springfield is not accidental. The show put her there deliberately and has kept her there deliberately because the gap between who she is and what her environment can offer her is, in itself, a story. A story about the specific pain of being exceptional in a place that punishes exceptionality. A story about the specific resilience required to maintain your values and your sense of self inside a community that is organized, not maliciously but effectively, against both of those things. That is a story worth telling. The show tells it, in individual episodes, with genuine care and genuine craft. What was canceled is the ending of that story. The ending of Lisa's Springfield story is her leaving. It is her finding, somewhere outside the town, a community that can hold what she is. A school that can teach her something she does not already know. A group of people who respond to her intelligence with recognition rather than discomfort. A world that is larger and more complicated and more equipped to receive her than the one she was born into. The show has given us glimpses of this ending. Lisa's wedding showed it clearly, set 15 years in the future, with Lisa at a British university engaged to a man who could match her intellectually. The ending was there. The show could see it. The flash forward was the show acknowledging that it knew where the story was supposed to go. And then the episode ended, and Lisa was 8 years old again. And the ending was canceled. Every episode since has been the cancellation of that ending, renewed. The version of Lisa's story that was quietly canceled is not a single episode or a single arc. It is the entire forward movement of the character's life. The story that was canceled is the story of Lisa Simpson growing up, leaving Springfield, arriving somewhere she belongs, becoming who the first 15 seasons of careful character construction were building toward. That story is still waiting, 8 years old and perpetually deferred, in a yellow house on Evergreen Terrace in a town that cannot hold her but will never let her go. Extended section. The town itself and the stories it should have told. Springfield as a setting was itself a canceled storyline. The first several seasons of the show built Springfield with the specific attention of writers who were constructing a place with a real civic history. The town had geography. It had neighborhoods. It had an economic structure. It had a political past. It had institutions with long histories and specific relationships to the other institutions around them. The Springfield of the early seasons was a place that felt like it had existed before the show started and would continue existing when the episode ended. That Springfield was gradually replaced by a more abstract Springfield, a Springfield that functioned primarily as a backdrop against which various comedy premises could be deployed without requiring the coherence of an actual place. The early Springfield had a downtown that meant something. Moe's Tavern was in a specific relationship to the Springfield Municipal Building, and to the Quickie Mart, and to the First Church of Springfield, and to the elementary school that made the geography of the town feel like a real geography rather than a collection of comedically convenient locations. You could, in the early seasons, imagine walking from one of these places to another. The distances felt real. The neighborhood felt inhabited. As the show progressed, these spatial relationships became increasingly unstable. Buildings appeared in different locations depending on the episode. The geography of the town became malleable, subject to whatever the current episode required. The sense of Springfield as a real place gradually gave way to Springfield as a production design convenience. This is, in part, simply what happens to long-running shows. The rigorous maintenance of internal consistency across hundreds of episodes over decades is genuinely difficult. Small inconsistencies accumulate. The writers of a particular episode do not always have access to or inclination toward the accumulated geographic and historical details established in previous seasons. But the loss of Springfield as a coherent place was more than a matter of accumulated inconsistency. It was the loss of the show's most interesting setting, a specific small American city with a specific history, specific economic pressures, specific political structures, and specific ways in which all of those things had shaped the lives of the people living inside them. The version of Springfield that was canceled is the version that could have been. The town with a real history of decisions made by identifiable people for identifiable reasons. The town where the decay of certain neighborhoods and the prosperity of others could be traced to specific choices made over decades. The town where the political corruption of Mayor Quimby and the economic dominance of Burns and the educational neglect of Springfield Elementary and the municipal dysfunction that produced things like the monorail were all part of a single coherent story about how a community can fail its own residents systematically and quietly for generations, without anyone with power ever needing to address the failure directly. That version of Springfield was being built in the early seasons. The writers were laying the groundwork for a place that could sustain serious examination alongside the comedy. The serious examination was never conducted. The groundwork was laid and then built over with increasingly abstract and increasingly interchangeable episode premises until the specific place that the early seasons had been establishing became the generic cartoon backdrop that the later seasons required. Springfield is still Springfield. It is just no longer the Springfield that the first several seasons were building toward. That Springfield, the one with a real civic history and a coherent geography and a specific set of stories buried in the relationship between its institutions and its residents, was canceled somewhere around season 9 or 10, replaced by a place that could be anywhere because it had stopped being anywhere specific. Extended section. The Burns Empire and the reckoning that was always approaching. Charles Montgomery Burns, across the entire run of the show, was being built toward something. The accumulation of information about Burns, across 36 seasons, suggests a character who was being developed not merely as a recurring villain but as the central antagonist of a story that was always about to arrive. The Burns of the early seasons was a figure of genuine menace, not the theatrical menace of Sideshow Bob, which always had the quality of a performance. The quiet, structural, patient menace of someone who has been accumulating power for a century and who understands, better than anyone around him, how power works. He owned the power plant. He owned, therefore, the electricity that Springfield ran on, which meant he owned, in the most practical sense, the conditions under which Springfield's population lived their daily lives. He owned Grandpa Simpson's silence through a deal made decades ago. He had driven Mona Simpson into exile and thereby, indirectly, shaped Homer's entire psychology. He had been keeping Homer employed as a deliberate strategic choice, ensuring that the safety inspector responsible for preventing the plant's many violations from becoming public knowledge was someone too cognitively compromised to understand what he was observing. The show established all of this across many seasons. Piece by piece, the portrait of Burns as the architect of Springfield's dysfunction was assembled. Not the only cause of it. Springfield's dysfunction has many parents. But Burns as its most consistent and most knowing contributor, the person who understood what the town was and what it was doing to its residents and who had made a series of deliberate choices to ensure that it continued, was the show's most sustained implicit argument about power and accountability. The reckoning that this portrait pointed toward was the moment when Springfield as a community recognized what Burns had done and held him accountable for it. The show circled this reckoning constantly. Episodes where Burns is exposed for something, where he faces the consequences of a specific action, where the community rises against him. Each time, the reckoning was partial and temporary. Burns was always restored to his position, his wealth, his power, his continued operation of a facility that the show had documented as a genuine, ongoing catastrophe for the people living near it. The episode where Burns blocks out the sun is the most dramatic version of this pattern. He goes too far. The community responds. He is shot by, according to the official account, Maggie Simpson. He nearly dies. He survives. And then Springfield moves on, and Burns is restored to his default condition, and the power plant continues operating with its 342 safety violations, and nothing that happened in that two-part episode left any permanent mark on the structure of Burns's power in Springfield. because the permanent present cannot accommodate the reckoning. The reckoning, if it arrived, would mean Burns losing the power plant. It would mean the plant being shut down, or taken over, or operated under actual regulatory oversight. It would mean the specific economic and social structure that Burns had maintained for a century beginning to change. And if the structure began to change, Springfield would begin to change, and a Springfield that was changing could not maintain the permanent present that the show required. So the reckoning was always approaching and never arriving. Burns always recovered. The power plant always kept running. And the accumulated history of what Burns had done to Springfield and to the specific people in it, to Mona Simpson, to Homer, to the community that had been drinking his plant's runoff for decades, was preserved in the episodes that documented it and never addressed in any episode that followed. The Reckoning with Burns was the show's most ambitious canceled storyline. Not because it was the most developed arc or the most emotionally charged character journey, but because it was the story that all the other stories were pointing toward. The story that, if told, would have required every other canceled storyline to be resolved as well. If Burns fell, Smithers' story would need resolution. If the plant was shut down, Homer's employment story would need resolution. If Springfield's contaminated water and air were addressed, the radiation theory that underlies the show's entire visual vocabulary would need resolution. If Burns's manipulation of Homer's family across 3 generations was acknowledged, Mona's story and Herb's story, and the story of what Homer might have been, would all need resolution. The Burns Reckoning was the story that would have resolved everything. It was canceled so quietly and so consistently that the cancellation itself became a structural feature of the show rather than a narrative choice. Burns kept surviving, the reckoning kept being deferred, and the story that was always approaching kept not arriving. It is still approaching. It will keep approaching. That is the nature of a story that was canceled before it could begin. Extended section: the retirement castle and the stories Springfield chose not to tell. The Springfield retirement castle appears in the show often enough to have its own established geography, its own staff, and its own recurring cast of elderly residents. Abe Simpson lives there. Various other Springfield seniors are depicted there in backgrounds and occasional foreground moments. The facility is, by the show's own depiction, consistently and systematically neglected, underfunded, and staffed by people who range from indifferent to actively unkind toward the people in their care. This should have been a storyline. The specific quality of how Springfield treats its elderly population is documented across enough episodes to constitute a pattern, and the pattern is dark enough that the show's consistent treatment of it as background is itself a choice worth examining. The retirement castle is a place where Springfield seniors are deposited and then largely forgotten. The families who have relatives there visit with varying consistency and engage with varying levels of genuine attention. The staff provides care that is, by any realistic standard, inadequate. The facility itself shows signs of the same institutional neglect that characterizes most of Springfield's public and semi-public infrastructure. Abe Simpson's story, specifically, was built across many seasons with a depth that implied a continuation that never came. Abe was a complicated character from the beginning. The show established him early as a figure of comedy. The rambling old man with stories that went nowhere and complaints that went unheard, and a son who managed his presence with the specific controlled patience of someone who loved his father and found him nearly impossible to be around. The comedy of Abe was real and it was good, and it was consistently well deployed. But the show also established, across those same seasons, something underneath the comedy. Abe had a history. He had served in World War II and had come home changed in ways that the episode Homer's Enemy briefly touched on. He had married a woman who was not, it turned out, Homer's mother, a fact whose implications for Abe's marriage and for what he had told Homer about his family were never fully examined. He had made a deal with Burns, in exchange for Homer's job security, that required him to maintain a silence about something he had witnessed. He had told Homer for years that his mother was dead, a lie whose specific shape and specific cost were the subject of one of the show's most genuinely moving episodes, but whose origin in Abe's psychology was never examined with any sustained attention. Abe was a man who had made choices across his adult life that had shaped his son's life in ways Homer was never fully informed about. The specific quality of Abe's fatherhood, what he had done right and what he had done wrong and what he had simply been unable to do, was the material for a genuine character examination. That examination was not written. Abe in later seasons became increasingly a source of comedy and increasingly less a character with a real interior life. His backstory, carefully established across the first decade of the show, was periodically revisited for individual episode purposes and never assembled into a coherent picture of who he was and what his life had meant. The version of Abe's story that was canceled is the version that follows the implications of what the show established about him. The version where Homer, armed with the knowledge he eventually gains about his mother and his father's deal with Burns, and the specific shape of the silence that was maintained around his childhood, finally has the conversation with his father that the accumulated history demands. That conversation was never written. Abe is still in the retirement castle, still telling stories that go nowhere, still waiting for Homer to visit with varying consistency. And the conversation that should have happened between them, the honest accounting of what the father did and what it cost the son and what, if anything, could be said about it now, sits permanently unwritten in the space between their Sunday afternoon visits. Extended section: the Springfield elementary teachers and the education that was never examined. Springfield Elementary is one of the show's most consistent settings. It appears in hundreds of episodes. Its physical layout is as familiar as the Simpson house. Its recurring staff, Principal Skinner, Mrs. Krabappel, Groundskeeper Willie, Lunch Lady Doris, have been developed across decades into some of the show's most precisely observed supporting characters. And the show has consistently declined to tell the story that all of that careful observation was pointing toward. Mrs. Edna Krabappel taught 4th grade at Springfield Elementary for most of the show's classic era. She was Bart's teacher, which positioned her as one of the primary adult presences in his school life. She was portrayed across many episodes with a complexity that distinguished her from simple comedic function. She was tired. She had been teaching for years in conditions that did not support teaching. She had given up on certain things and maintained specific hopes about others. She drank. She smoked. She dated with the specific quality of someone who was not looking for perfection but who was looking for something and was not finding it. The show was building, in Krabappel, a portrait of what happens to people who enter education with genuine intention and encounter, year after year, the specific combination of institutional neglect and social indifference that American public education consistently delivers to its teachers. Krabappel was not a bad teacher. She was a tired teacher. There is a difference, and the show knew the difference, and many of the episodes centered on her were genuinely interested in exploring it. But the show never told the full story of Edna Krabappel. It told individual episode versions of her story. Episodes where she had a relationship and the relationship complicated her professional life. Episodes where her frustration with Bart produced something in their dynamic that was more honest than the standard student-teacher relationship. Episodes where her specific quality of compressed disappointment became briefly visible and then was covered over again. What was never told was the accumulated story of those episodes, assembled into a portrait of a woman's professional life and what it had cost her and what, if anything, remained of the person she had been when she began. Marcia Wallace died in 2013, and Edna Krabappel was retired in the same gesture of respect that had been extended to Troy McClure and Lionel Hutz. And with her retirement went the final possibility of telling the story that had been building in her character across 2 decades. What was canceled was not a single arc. It was the accumulated history of a teaching career in a place that did not value teaching. A career spent trying to reach a specific child who was actively resisting being reached. A professional life that had produced something, in the space between Krabappel and Bart, that neither of them would ever name directly. That something was still there in her last episodes, still visible in the specific quality of her interactions with Bart. Still pointing toward a story that neither of them would ever know was being told about them. The story ended with Marcia Wallace's death. The something between Krabappel and Bart is still there, in every episode that depicted it, permanently suspended and permanently incomplete. Extended section: the Futuramas that were never followed. The show produced several flash-forward episodes across its run, and each of them was a canceled storyline in its own right. Lisa's wedding, already discussed at length, was the most complete, but there were others. Bart to the Future from Season 11 depicted a future in which Bart was a 40-year-old musician of modest success, living in a time when his sister Lisa had just been elected the first straight female president of the United States, an episode primarily famous now for depicting Donald Trump as her predecessor. But the portrait of adult Bart that the episode constructed was, in its own quieter way, more interesting than the political prediction. Bart at 40 was Bart extended forward through the logic of who Bart was at 10. He had not transformed into someone unrecognizable. He was the same person, with the same qualities, navigating a later stage of life with the same combination of charm and fundamental aimlessness that had always characterized him. He was not a success story. He was not a tragedy. He was a person who had moved through the world mostly sideways, finding ways to get by, maintaining the essential qualities of himself, neither fully becoming what he was capable of becoming, nor fully failing to become anything. That is a recognizable and genuinely human outcome. The person who at 40 is still themselves at 10, somewhat changed by circumstance, somewhat changed by experience, but fundamentally continuous with who they were at the beginning. The episode used this portrait for its plot purposes and then moved on. What was never done with it was the examination of the specific path that led from Bart at 10 to Bart at 40. The specific choices and the specific accidents of circumstance, and the specific relationships, and the specific missed opportunities, and the specific moments of genuine achievement that produced the adult that the child was becoming. That path was visible in the flash forward. It was implied by every detail of adult Bart's life, but the show never walked it. The episode depicting Homer and Marge's eventual future, glimpsed across various flash-forward sequences across the show's run, followed a similar pattern. The future Simpsons that these sequences depicted were consistent with who the current Simpsons were. They were not transformed by time in ways that felt unearned. But the specific story of how they got from here to there, the texture of the years between the episode's present and the flash-forward's future, was never told. The flash-forwards were the show acknowledging, repeatedly, that it knew where the characters were going. They were proof that the writers could imagine the future of these people with enough clarity and specificity to depict it convincingly. They were also proof that the show was never going to tell you how they got there. The journey between the present and each of those futures was the canceled story. The flash-forward was the destination. The path to the destination was the thing that was quietly and permanently deferred. Extended section: the Burns-Homer history and the recognition that never came. Homer Simpson has worked for Charles Montgomery Burns for his entire adult professional life. This is the most documented fact in the show's universe. Homer's employment at the Springfield nuclear power plant in Sector 7G as a safety inspector has been the structural premise of the show since its beginning. Burns, across this same period, has consistently been unable to remember Homer's name. This is played for comedy throughout the show, and the comedy is good. Burns cycles through wrong names for Homer with a specificity that suggests not simply bad memory, but a kind of principled indifference to the individual identities of the people who work for him. Homer is, to Burns, a function rather than a person. Safety inspector in Sector 7G, interchangeable with any other occupant of that role. The comedy of this is real. The darkness underneath it is also real. And the show was, across many seasons, building towards something with this specific dynamic that it never arrived at. Because Homer knows who Burns is. Homer knows, from the revelation in Mother Simpson, that the man who signs his paychecks is the man who destroyed his family. Burns drove Mona Simpson into exile when Homer was a child. Burns's identification of her to the FBI cost Homer 27 years without his mother. Burns's refusal to let the matter rest cost Homer a second goodbye in Season 7 when Mona was forced to flee again. And Burns will cost Homer the final farewell as well, in the later episode where Mona dies, because the shape of Homer's relationship with his mother was determined entirely by what Burns did in 1969. Homer knows this. The episode Mother Simpson established it clearly and without ambiguity. Homer stood at the window of his house and watched his mother drive away for the second time, forced out by the same man he would go to work for the next morning. And then Homer went back to work, and Burns still could not remember his name. The show acknowledged this through Homer's behavior in individual episodes, when the connection was directly relevant to the plot. It never acknowledged it as the ongoing presence it should have been. Homer's daily experience of working for the man who destroyed his family was not depicted as an ongoing wait. It was depicted as a background premise that could be activated for episode purposes and then returned to storage. The version of Homer's story that was canceled is the version in which Homer's awareness of what Burns did to his family is a living part of his daily experience, in which every morning when he drives to the plant and swipes his badge and walks to his workstation, he is doing so inside the awareness of what that building and the man who owns it have cost him, in which Burns's inability to remember Homer's name is not simply comic, but is the specific and grinding reminder that the man who took Homer's childhood from him does not even register Homer's existence as a fact worth tracking. That is a story about something real, about the specific experience of working for someone who has harmed you in ways you cannot address, whose power over your livelihood prevents the confrontation that the harm demands, about the cost of maintaining the daily performance of normalcy inside a situation that is, looked at honestly, anything but normal. Homer cannot afford to confront Burns. His employment depends on the continued goodwill, or at least the continued indifference, of a man who has every reason to make Homer's life more difficult if Homer becomes inconvenient. The economic constraint that keeps Homer at the plant is the same economic constraint that keeps him silent about what he knows. That silence has a cost. That cost should be visible. The show gave us the silence. It canceled the cost. Extended section, Bart's academic life and the path never taken. Bart Simpson was failing school at the beginning of the show and is, by the logic of the permanent present, still failing school 36 years later. The academic failure is not played as simple comedy. The show in its early seasons was genuinely interested in what Bart's failure meant and where it was coming from and what the specific dynamics of his relationship with learning actually looked like. He was not stupid. The show established this early and maintained it consistently. Bart's intelligence was practical, creative, and social. He understood people. He understood systems well enough to subvert them with consistent creativity. He understood consequences well enough to plan around them, at least in the short term. He had the kind of intelligence that did not translate into academic performance, not because the intelligence was absent, but because the format of academic performance did not engage it. This is a recognizable situation. The student whose abilities are real but whose relationship with the institutional form that education takes is fundamental opposition rather than fundamental alignment. The student who learns constantly and continuously in every context except the one that is officially designated for learning. The early seasons were clearly interested in examining this. The episode where Bart is diagnosed as gifted. The episodes where specific teachers, Mrs. Krabappel occasionally among them, got through to something in him. The episodes where his natural intelligence and creativity were given a legitimate outlet and produced something genuinely impressive. Each of these episodes was establishing a portrait of a student whose failure was not the full picture and whose relationship with learning was more complicated than the simple binary of pass and fail suggested. The show never followed this portrait to its natural conclusion. The natural conclusion was Bart finding what his intelligence was for, what it needed to be challenged, what it looked like when it was engaged by something that actually required it, the specific form that Bart's particular kind of mind could take if it found the right application. The show glimpsed this conclusion occasionally. The episodes where Bart demonstrated something that surprised even him, the moments where the performance of indifference slipped and something genuine and capable was briefly visible underneath it. Those moments were never assembled into the story they were pointing at. The story of what Bart's intelligence was actually for, what it looked like when it found its real direction, what Bart became when he stopped being the sum of his failures and became instead the expression of what he was actually capable of. That story was canceled. Bart, at 36 years into the show, is still failing school, still performing the indifference, still not knowing, apparently, what his mind is for. The answer was always there in the episodes that caught him unguarded. The show just never chose to look directly at it. Conclusion. What the quiet cancellations tell us about Springfield. We have spent a long time in Springfield tonight, moving slowly through the stories that were started and not finished, the threads introduced with genuine care and genuine intention, and then, one day, allowed to trail off. Sideshow Bob's Italian village and the life he had built there. Apu's rich history and his complicated marriage. Troy McClure's secret and the story Phil Hartman was going to tell. Marge's slot machine and the months that followed it that the show would not depict. Greta Wolfcastle and the tenderness that went nowhere. Smithers and the 30 years of devotion and the conversation that was never had. Lisa's Buddhism and the spiritual life it implied. Cecil Terwilliger and the dynasty between the two brothers. Herb Powell and the question of what made one man Homer and the other man not. Springfield's political world and the stories hidden inside it. Maggie's intelligence and the moment that keeps not arriving. The financial ruin that heals between episodes without scars. Frank Grimes and the question his death buried. The Skinner-Chalmers dynamic and its institutional honesty. The guest characters who deserved continuations. Lisa and the question of leaving. The town itself and the stories it should have told. The Burns empire and its deferred reckoning. Abe Simpson and the conversation his son never had with him. Edna Krabappel and the teaching career never fully examined. The flash-forward futures and the paths to them that were never walked. The Burns-Homer history and the recognition that never came. Bart's academic life and the path his intelligence was pointing toward. Each of these stories is different in its subject, but every single one of them is a story about what happens when the permanent present tense of Springfield is threatened by the intrusion of something real. Consequences are real, love is real, loss is real. Time passing is real. The accumulation of choices made and things said and things done, carried forward from one episode to the next, changing the shape of who the characters are, is real. Springfield's permanent present tense cannot accommodate these things. The mechanism by which Springfield maintains itself against the natural pressure of time and cause and effect is the same mechanism that was described in the episode about Principal Skinner's true identity. The town votes, collectively and tacitly, to maintain the comfortable fiction against the inconvenient truth. The vote happens between every episode and every following episode. The vote is always unanimous. The truth is always exiled and the fiction is always restored to its place. The canceled storylines are all in their different ways, the truths that kept being put to the vote and kept losing. Bob's genuine desire for a different life. Marge's genuine vulnerability underneath her composure. Smithers' genuine feelings and what they deserved. Lisa's genuine need to be somewhere she could breathe. Herb's genuine claim on Homer's attention. Maggie's genuine extraordinariness and what it implied for the future. Burns's genuine accountability for what he had done to Springfield and to the specific people in it. Each of these was a truth that the permanent present voted against, over and over, until the voting became invisible and the exile became simply the way things were. The canceled storylines are not failures of writing. They are, in their own way, the show telling the truth about itself. About the cost of the permanent present. About what has to be sacrificed to maintain a world where the children never age and the house is always there, and the same family sits on the same couch every Sunday night, as though 36 years have not passed. What had to be sacrificed was the truth of each of these stories, the real resolution of Bob's arc, the real examination of Marge's inner life, the real conversation between Homer and Abe about what the silence cost them both, the real arrival of Maggie into her own extraordinary potential. Each of these was a price the permanent present required. And the permanent present paid the price, over and over, without ever acknowledging what was being given up. But the stories themselves did not disappear just because the show stopped telling them. They are still in the episodes that built toward them. They are in the specific looks on specific faces at specific moments. They are in Marge pulling the slot machine lever while Maggie cries in the hotel room. They are in Bob watching his Italian life collapse across a dinner table. They are in Smithers looking at Burns with the full weight of 3 decades behind the look. They are in Maggie waiting in the empty room after everyone else has gone. They are in Lisa staring at the school building that cannot hold her and choosing, again, to walk through its doors anyway. The stories are there, they were always there, and they are still waiting, in the quiet of a town that has never quite finished anything it started, for the episode that finally follows them home. That episode will not come. The permanent present will not allow it. The vote will always go the same way, and the truth will always be escorted to the town limits, and Springfield will wake up the next morning looking exactly as it did the morning before. But tonight, in the quiet before sleep, we have given those stories something the show would not give them. We have given them our attention. We have followed them far enough to see what they were reaching toward. We have sat with the weight of what was accumulated in all those careful episodes and never resolved. And that is something. That is perhaps the only thing these stories were ever going to get. So sleep now. Let Springfield settle into the particular quiet it has at this hour, when the comedy is finished and the episode has ended, and the permanent present is holding everything in place. The cooling towers glow faintly against the dark sky. The Quickie Mart is still lit, fluorescent, and steadfast, open as it always is. The house on Evergreen Terrace is dark. Everyone is asleep, or nearly so. Maggie is in her crib, watching the ceiling with those enormous eyes. Somewhere in a Springfield prison, Cecil Terwilliger is thinking something precise and patient. Somewhere in Italy, the house in a small Tuscan village stands empty and has stood empty for years, and the neighbors do not ask why. Herb Powell is somewhere, successful again in all probability, not waiting for a phone to ring because he learned long ago that it does not ring. And Smithers is wherever Smithers goes after Burns has retired for the evening, sitting with the specific weight of 30 years organized around a single person who has never fully seen him. These are the people the show built and then left here, in the permanent present, carrying the stories they were never allowed to finish. They will be here in the morning. They will be here every morning. That is the nature of a place that has canceled time itself. Springfield endures. The stories endure. And somewhere in the space between them, in the quiet where all the canceled storylines live, something is still waiting to be said. It may wait forever, but it has not given up. Neither should you. Sleep well. If you made it this far, leave a comment with where you are watching from and what time it is. Subscribe if you want more of this. Springfield has more quiet roads than we walked tonight, and the stories that were never told have no shortage of detail to follow. Deep section. The Springfield Elementary Science Fair, and the curiosity that was never nurtured. There is a recurring pattern in how the show depicted Lisa's relationship with the Springfield school system, and that pattern was pointing toward a story that the show kept circling and never entered. Lisa won the school science fair in at least one episode. She also lost it under circumstances that illuminated something specific about the relationship between genuine intellectual achievement and the institutional machinery that is supposed to reward it. The losing was more interesting than the winning because the losing was honest about something. It was honest about the specific way that educational institutions can recognize ability without actually supporting it, can deploy the language of nurturing exceptional students, while in practice doing exactly the opposite, can give an award in a context so constrained by budget limitations and institutional indifference that the award means almost nothing to the recipient. The show visited the science fair, the spelling bee, the academic decathlon, and various other competitive academic contexts across its run. In each of these contexts, Lisa was the best student, and in each of them the outcome was shaped by forces that had nothing to do with her actual ability. Politics, personality. The specific quality of adult judgment in situations where adult judgment was not being exercised with any particular care. The pattern was clear, and the show clearly knew it was a pattern. But the story that the pattern was pointing toward, the story of what Lisa's experience of consistently being the most capable student in a system that was not designed to serve her, actually cost her, was never assembled from the individual episodes that were building its case. Consider what the show established about Springfield Elementary's academic culture across all those episodes. The school had inadequate funding, documented repeatedly and specifically. Teacher pay was low enough to produce chronic problems with retention and motivation. The curriculum was constrained by administrative decisions that had nothing to do with educational outcomes and everything to do with cost management. The students who were genuinely exceptional, Lisa most visibly among them but not exclusively, were served by a system that acknowledged their exceptionality in the most minimal way possible, while devoting most of its resources to maintaining the basic functioning of an institution that was struggling to do even that. The specific cost of this to Lisa was visible in individual episodes. The specific cost of this to the community was also visible in the quality of the students that Springfield Elementary produced and the educational outcomes that its alumni experienced. But neither cost was ever tracked across episodes in a way that allowed the full weight of what the school was and was not doing to become visible as a single coherent portrait. The story that was canceled was the story of what Springfield Elementary actually was. Not as a comedy backdrop where various classroom hijinks could occur, as a real institution with a real history of specific decisions made by specific people with specific consequences for specific students. The story of what it meant to be Edna Krabappel, teaching in this institution for years, watching students pass through who were either served by what she could offer or failed by the gap between what she could offer and what they needed. The story of what it meant to be Lisa, educated in this institution year after year, receiving the minimum required acknowledgement of her abilities, while being surrounded by a system that was not designed to do with her abilities what her abilities deserved. That story was accumulating in every Springfield Elementary episode. It was never told directly. Deep section, Marge's creative life and the talent that had nowhere to go. In Season 3, the show gave us Marge Gets a Job, and in Season 4, it gave us A Streetcar Named Marge, and across these and several other episodes, it established something specific about Marge Simpson that the show never fully explored. Marge had talent, not in the vague sense in which people sometimes say that someone has potential, in the specific, documented sense that the show established across multiple episodes. She was a genuinely skilled artist. Her painting ability, depicted in the episode where she takes up the hobby and develops real technical facility with it, was not simply wish fulfillment on the show's part. The show depicted her artistic development with enough specificity and enough honest attention to the actual process of learning a craft that it read as a genuine portrait of someone discovering a real ability. Her theatrical talent, demonstrated in the Streetcar Named Marge episode, was similarly specific. She could act, she could project, she could find the emotional truth of a scene and transmit it to an audience with the particular economy of means that genuine stage acting requires. The show made this visible not by asserting it, but by depicting it. You saw Marge on stage and you understood, in the specific way that only watching someone perform can communicate, that she was genuinely good at this. And then these abilities were returned to the background, and life at 742 Evergreen Terrace resumed. The story that the show was building across these episodes was the story of what happens to talent that has no appropriate context. Marge's artistic ability and theatrical ability and whatever other capacities were suggested across various episodes existed in a daily life that had no room for them. Not because Homer was hostile to them, though Homer was occasionally oblivious in ways that made room hard to find, but because the structure of Marge's daily existence, the management of the household and the children, and the continuous low-level crisis that Homer's various adventures generated, left no consistent space for anything that was only for her. This is a recognizable situation. The person whose abilities are real but whose context for exercising them is not available. Whose daily life is organized entirely around other people's needs and whose own needs, including the need to exercise what they are genuinely good at, exist in the margins that get cut first when the margins get squeezed. The show depicted this situation in individual episodes with honesty and care. It never assembled those episodes into the sustained examination the situation deserved. The version of Marge's story that was canceled is the version in which her creative abilities are understood as ongoing facts about her, rather than episode premises to be deployed and then set aside. The version in which the question of what Marge is when she is not managing the household becomes the show's genuine subject rather than its occasional premise. That version would have required giving Marge a life outside the house at 742 Evergreen Terrace, not as a substitute for the life inside it, but as an addition to it. The specific and difficult negotiation of what it means to be a devoted mother and wife, and also a person who has talents and needs and a relationship with her own abilities, that exists independently of her function in the family. The show glimpsed this version in those episodes. It canceled the sustained examination in favor of the reset, every time. Deep section, the diverse Springfield that was never fully seen. Springfield, as established across the first decade of the show, was a genuinely diverse community. This is not always remembered, because the show's most prominent and most repeatedly examined residents were white, but the background and the margins of Springfield were populated with characters whose presences implied a fuller portrait of the community than the central storylines depicted. Dr. Hibbert, the Simpson family's physician, was one of the show's most consistent supporting characters. He was also one of the show's least examined. The show gave Dr. Hibbert a family, a professional history, a specific quality of slightly inappropriate laughter at medically unsuitable moments, and a presence in the show that stretched across almost every season of its run. He was, in the literal sense, the person who had delivered all three Simpson children. He had been part of the Simpson family's most significant moments in the specific professional capacity of the person who was there when things went medically wrong or medically right. And the show almost never looked at his life directly. There were episodes where Dr. Hibbert was a more central figure, episodes that touched on his family, episodes that used his professional life as the premise for examination. But the accumulated weight of his presence in the show was never used to construct the story that his presence implied was available. The story of a black professional in a predominantly white small city, navigating the specific dynamics of that position across decades, managing a medical practice in a community where the medical needs were substantially shaped by the environmental contamination that the power plant had been producing for as long as he had been practicing. Dr. Hibbert knew, or should have known, what the radiation exposure in Springfield was doing to the people he was treating. He was the doctor who saw the results of that exposure in his patients. He was the person with the professional training to recognize the pattern, to understand what the pattern meant, to understand its cause. The show never asked what he did with that knowledge. The version of Springfield that was canceled is the version that looked honestly at the full community, not just the Simpson family and their immediate social circle, but the whole town, in its full demographic and human complexity. The version that gave Dr. Hibbert the story his position in the show implied was available. The version that examined what Apu's experience of Springfield looked like, from inside rather than from the convenience store's counter. The version that followed the various background characters who populated the town's margins into the fuller lives that their careful depictions suggested they were living. That Springfield, the one with a full human population whose stories were all worth telling, was always there in the background. It was never brought forward. The stories of Springfield's full community were canceled in favor of the stories of the family at 742 Evergreen Terrace, which were themselves, as we have spent this entire night examining, largely canceled in favor of the permanent presence maintenance of itself. Deep section. The late seasons and what they took with them. There is a conventional narrative about the later seasons of The Simpsons that goes something like this. The show used to be good, and then it got bad, and the point at which it got bad can be identified with varying precision depending on who you ask, but is generally located somewhere between Season 9 and Season 13. After that point, the show lost something irreplaceable and kept going anyway. This narrative is not entirely wrong. Something did change. The specific quality of the early seasons, the combination of satirical sharpness and genuine emotional warmth and careful character observation that made the show extraordinary rather than simply good, became less consistent as the show continued. Individual episodes in the later seasons were very good. Many were not. The average quality changed in ways that were visible and meaningful. But the conventional narrative misses something important about what happened to the canceled storylines in the later seasons. Because the later seasons did not simply fail to tell new stories. They also, frequently, retroactively damaged the stories that had been building in the earlier seasons. The Armin Tamzarian episode damaged Skinner's accumulated character history, as we discussed. Various later episodes introduced backstory revisions to characters that complicated or contradicted the backstory the earlier seasons had carefully established. The tonal shift toward more surreal and more consequence-free storytelling made it harder, not easier, for the canceled storylines of the early seasons to be picked back up. What the later seasons added to the list of canceled storylines was the possibility of continuity itself. By the time the show reached its 12th or 13th season, the institutional memory of what had been established in the earlier seasons was sufficiently attenuated, and the show's commitment to maintaining internal consistency was sufficiently reduced, that the careful character building of the first decade could no longer function as the foundation for the kind of sustained storyline development that the early episodes had been pointing toward. The canceled storylines of the early seasons were canceled twice. In other words, first by the episodic reset that prevented any single storyline from being continued in the episode following its introduction. And then by the cumulative drift of the later seasons, which made the careful foundations of the early seasons harder to return to and build on. The later seasons did not tell the stories the earlier seasons had been setting up. They also gradually made it harder to imagine those stories being told. The Springfield of season 25 was not a place where Bob's genuine redemption arc could land with the weight that the Italian Bob had established, because the show's relationship with emotional truth had become too inconsistent to sustain the landing. The Springfield of season 28 was not a place where Smithers' coming out could produce the reckoning with Burns that 30 seasons of build-up deserved, because the show's ability to hold the weight of 3 decades of character history in a single episode was no longer what it had been. The later seasons canceled not just specific storylines, but the conditions under which those storylines could have been told. That is a different and darker kind of cancellation. Deep section. What Springfield said about America and what America did with it. The Simpsons was, from its first season, a show about America. Specifically and consistently and deliberately about America. About the specific texture of American working class and middle class life. About the specific quality of American civic failure and American institutional incompetence and American political corruption at the local level. About the specific way that the American dream functioned as a promise that was, for many of its promised recipients, somewhere between difficult to access and structurally unavailable. The show said these things through comedy, which is how the show said everything. But it said them clearly, and it said them consistently, and it said them with a level of specificity that distinguished them from the vague cultural satire that more cautious shows deployed on the same subjects. And then America changed in ways that the show's canceled storylines had been pointing at for years, and the show found itself in the peculiar position of having depicted the direction of travel without having followed its own characters through the territory it had identified. The specific qualities of American life that the show documented in its early seasons, the economic anxiety, the political susceptibility to charismatic grifters, the institutional indifference to the people those institutions were supposed to serve, the specific way that American communities manage collective denial as a strategy for avoiding the costs of confronting their own failures. All of these became, in the years following the show's golden era, more visible features of American public life rather than less. The show had identified these things. It had named them. It had, in its way, warned about them. And then it canceled the storylines that would have followed its characters through the world those things were producing. Homer, who was already in 1993 a portrait of a specific kind of American economic precariousness, working a job he did not fully understand in a facility that was actively harming him, loyal to an employer who did not know his name, became more, rather than less recognizable, as American working life evolved in the decades that followed. The story of what happens to people like Homer in the economic conditions that followed the show's early seasons, the story of how the specific precariousness depicted in the first decade of Springfield's economic life becomes the normality of the decades after, was not told in the show. The show had built the character who would tell that story. It had built the setting in which that story would be told. It had documented across hundreds of episodes the specific conditions that made the story possible. And then it canceled the story in favor of the permanent present. The America that Springfield was pointing at arrived anyway, without the show's characters to walk through it. Without the story that might have made it make sense. Springfield was the diagnosis. The treatment was the canceled storylines that would have followed from the diagnosis honestly and without the reset that prevented any diagnosis from mattering beyond the episode that delivered it. The canceled storylines are not just stories about fictional characters in a fictional town. They are, at their most serious, the places where the show came closest to following the implications of its own most honest observations about American life. And the fact that those places are all canceled, all reset, all return to the permanent present is itself a statement about something, about the limits of what comedy can do with the truth it discovers, about the specific cost of maintaining the cheerful permanent present when the truth the show had been documenting pointed towards something considerably darker and more permanent. Springfield kept the lights on, the plant kept running, Homer kept going to work. And the stories that would have followed from that truth were quietly canceled, one by one, in the space between every episode and the one that followed it. Final section. Why we come back anyway. We have spent this entire night in the company of stories that were not told. Stories that were built toward and abandoned. Characters that were given enough depth to sustain real journeys, and then kept from taking those journeys. Threads that were introduced with genuine intention and then allowed to trail off into the silence that Springfield uses instead of resolution. And yet, we come back. The show has been running for 36 years and people are still watching. Not just out of habit, though habit is part of it. Not just out of nostalgia, though nostalgia is part of it too. There is something in Springfield that keeps being worth returning to, even knowing, as we now know more clearly than before, what the show has declined to give us. What is that thing? It is perhaps the canceled storylines themselves. Because the canceled storylines are not simply absences. They are presences of a particular kind. The presence of everything that was established and not resolved. The presence of the potential that was introduced and not followed. The presence of the stories that the show came close to telling and then chose not to tell. And potential that is present but not realized has a specific quality. It has the quality of something still possible, still waiting, not yet closed. Bob in that Tuscan village, before the Simpsons arrived at the dinner table, was still the person he had become. The episode that comes before the Italian Bob does not erase who he was in that village. The episode that comes after does not erase it either. He was that person. He had that life. The potential of that life is documented in the episode whether or not the episode follows through on it. Marge at that slot machine was genuinely herself, the most honest self the show had ever depicted for her. The episode that followed did not erase her. She was that person. She had that vulnerability. The potential story that her vulnerability pointed toward is documented in the episode whether or not the episode follows through on it. Maggie in that empty room, checking that no one was watching before she mimed the gesture of firing the gun, was exactly as intelligent and as strategic and as extraordinary as the gesture suggested. Nothing in the subsequent decades of her appearances at the show's margins erased that. She was that person. The potential of what that person might become is documented in the episode, and in every episode since that has added another piece of evidence to the accumulation. The canceled storylines are, in this sense, not canceled at all. They are deferred. They exist in the space between what the show established and what the show chose to do with what it established. And that space is not empty. It is full of everything the show built and left there. Full of the accumulated weight of all those careful episodes, full of the potential that was documented and not realized. And every time we return to Springfield, every time we sit down with a familiar episode or encounter a new one, we are returning to that space. We are choosing to be in the presence of all those deferred stories, all that unrealized potential, all those doors that were opened and left ajar. We come back because Springfield still has all of that in it. Every piece of it is still there. Every careful character study that was built and not followed. Every emotional truth that was documented and not developed. Every thread that was introduced with genuine intention and left suspended in the permanent present. Springfield is, in this reading, not a completed story. It is a collection of uncompleted ones, preserved in the amber of the permanent present, available for return whenever the night gets quiet and the desire for their company becomes strong enough. The stories were not told, but they are still there. They have always been there. And so, Springfield endures. Not despite the canceled storylines, but in some important way, because of them. Because the things that were almost said are sometimes more present than the things that were said. Because potential has a kind of weight that realization can sometimes disperse. Because a door left ajar is, in the imagination, more interesting than a door that was walked through and closed behind you. The Simpsons is a show about everything it chose not to say, about every story it built toward and then canceled, about every character developed with care and then returned to their default setting, about every door it opened and then left ajar, and we come back because the ajar doors are still there. The potential is still there, the deferred stories are still there. Maggie is still in her crib, watching the ceiling with those extraordinary eyes. Bob is still carrying the memory of a Tuscan village he was not allowed to keep. Smithers is still carrying 30 years of organized devotion that was never directly acknowledged. Lisa is still 8 years old in a town that cannot hold her, still refusing to stop asking the questions nobody wants her to ask. Homer is still going to work every morning for the man who took his mother away, still unable to connect the dots that the show connected across 20 seasons, still starting fresh every day inside the permanent present that protects him from the weight of everything he has been unable to understand. These are the people. These are the stories. They are not finished. They are not resolved. They are not the tidy conclusions that all that careful building seemed to be pointing toward. They are exactly what they are. Potential deferred indefinitely in a town that has outlawed time. Stories left exactly where they were when the show decided to stop telling them. Waiting. Still waiting. The way everything in Springfield always waits. Sleep now. The night is long and Springfield is patient. It has been waiting for 36 years and it knows how to wait. The stories will still be there in the morning. All of them. Every one that was built and canceled and deferred. Every door still ajar. Every thread still suspended. Springfield endures. The permanent present holds. The Quickie Mart is still lit from within. And in the house on Evergreen Terrace, everyone is asleep. Everyone except Maggie. She never sleeps. She is always watching. And whatever she has been watching for, across 36 years of deliberate silence, she has not yet decided that the time has come to stop watching. Perhaps she never will. Perhaps she will. Good night. This has been a long journey through the quieter parts of Springfield. Thank you for staying with it. If you are reading this at the end, having made it all the way through, drop your location and time in the comments. And if you want more nights like this one, subscribe. The stories that were never told have no shortage of detail, and Springfield's quiet roads go on considerably further than we walk tonight. Bonus section. The Bouvier sisters and the lives the show never examined. Patty and Selma Bouvier are two of the most consistently present supporting characters in the show's entire run. They appear in hundreds of episodes. They have established lives. They have jobs at the DMV, with a particular authority and a particular brand of slow institutional power that the show observed with consistent affection. They have romantic histories that the show revisited periodically. They have, between them, a relationship to Marge that was carefully developed across the early seasons into something more complex than simple sisterhood. And the show never told their story. What the show established about Patty and Selma, across all those appearances, was a portrait of two women who had decided, at some point that predated the show and was never directly examined, that the life they expected to have was not going to materialize, and who had organized their subsequent existence around that decision. They were not simply bitter about it. They were, in their specific way, at peace with it, in the way that people who have genuinely stopped expecting something are sometimes more peaceful than people who are still waiting. The smoking, the game shows, the specific quality of their apartment, their relationship with Marge, who had chosen differently and whose choice they viewed with a mixture of genuine love and genuine bafflement, their periodic romantic adventures, each of which ended in a way that confirmed, rather than challenged their existing understanding of what was available to them. All of this was assembled across many years of appearances into a portrait that was specific and human, and quietly sad in the specific way that people who have given up on certain things without ceasing to carry the shape of those things are quietly sad. But the show never went inside it. The portrait was always observed from the outside. Through the comedy of their specific qualities, the chain smoking and the game shows, and the particular brand of their dismissal of Homer, the story of who they were before the show started, what they had expected, and what they had adjusted to, what the adjustment had cost them and what it had given them instead, was never directly told. The episode A Fish Called Selma gave Selma the most sustained examination the show ever extended to either of them. Her relationship with Troy McClure was real in the way the episode allowed it to be real, and the episode used it to say something honest about Selma's relationship with loneliness and with what she was and was not willing to accept in her attempts to address it. That episode stood somewhat apart from the show's usual treatment of Selma precisely because it was willing to look at her directly rather than from the angle that made her comic function most efficiently. But even A Fish Called Selma was a single episode, and the story it told of Selma's inner life was one episode long and then returned to the background. The version of the Bouvier sisters' story that was canceled is the version that examines who they actually are, not as foils for Homer and Marge's relationship, not as reliable sources of specific comedy beats, as people with their own histories and their own interior lives and their own specific relationship to the lives they are living, which is not a relationship of simple contentment but not quite of simple bitterness either, something more specific than either, something the show had the material to explore and chose not to. The apartments where Patty and Selma live, separately and then together at various points in the show's run, are full of the evidence of that unexplored story. The photographs on the shelves, the specific arrangement of objects that communicates, if you look at it closely enough, a particular set of choices made at a particular time for reasons the show implies and never explains. Those reasons are the story. The story was canceled in favor of the comedy. Bonus section: Barney Gumble and the recovery that was almost real. Barney Gumble is Homer's oldest friend. He appears in the show from its earliest seasons as a defining feature of the social world at Moe's Tavern, the person who represents in his specific and highly visible way the furthest extent to which Homer's trajectory could go if certain things went differently. Barney was not always what he is. The show established this carefully across multiple flashback episodes. He was, as a young man, a person of genuine promise. He was going to college. He was academically capable. He was, in the specific ways that mattered in the world he came from, set up to become something different from the man he became. And then Homer, in a flashback episode that depicted the specific moment of divergence, offered him his first beer. And Barney's relationship with alcohol developed from that point into the defining feature of his adult life. The show was honest about this. It was honest about what Barney had given up. It was also honest, in a way that the show rarely managed with this kind of darkness, about what the alcoholism had cost him specifically rather than in general. The specific loss of the person he had been becoming. The specific quality of what remained, which was intelligence and warmth and genuine decency, all of it operating at a fraction of its potential because the alcohol had become the primary organizing feature of his daily existence. And then, in season 11, Barney got sober. Homer's barbershop quartet had touched on Barney's musical ability. A later episode showed him directing a film of genuine artistic merit, demonstrating that whatever the alcohol had suppressed was not gone but was simply not consistently accessible. And season 11's Days of Wine and Dioses gave him sobriety, in an episode that treated the achievement with more seriousness than the show often extended to Barney's situations. The sobriety was maintained for several episodes. Barney was present in subsequent episodes as a sober person. He was, during this period, reaching for something. The show was clearly indicating that his sobriety was a genuine turning point, rather than simply a premise for an episode. And then the sobriety gradually faded from the show's depiction of him, not explicitly reversed, not dramatically abandoned, simply allowed to become less and less the defining feature of his character until the default Barney, the one organized around his relationship with alcohol, was restored to his usual place. What was canceled was the story of Barney's actual recovery, not the achievement of sobriety, which the show depicted, but the sustained experience of being sober in a life that had been organized around not being sober. The specific difficulty of maintaining a new relationship with yourself and with the world when the previous relationship had been so thoroughly established. The question of what Barney, sober and in possession of himself, actually did with what he had recovered. The show gave Barney sobriety and then took it back by attrition, by allowing the default to be restored without ever directly addressing what had happened to the sobriety or why. What was lost was the most interesting chapter of Barney's story, the one in which he discovered, or did not discover, who he was when the alcohol was not the primary lens through which he experienced everything. That chapter is still possible, in theory. The permanent present allows it. But it has been deferred for long enough that the possibility feels more theoretical than imminent. Barney is still at Moe's. He is still, in the ambient depiction of his daily life, organized primarily around his relationship with alcohol. The person he almost became, during the period of sobriety, is still there somewhere in the show's established history. In the episodes that depicted him during that period, in the specific quality that was visible in those episodes, the intelligence and the warmth and the genuine decency, operating closer to their full capacity than they were usually allowed to operate. That person is still somewhere inside the man at the bar. The story of the gap between them was canceled before it could be told. Bonus section: the show's relationship with its own history. There is something worth examining about the specific mechanism by which all these storylines were canceled, because the mechanism is not the same in every case, and the differences matter. Some storylines were canceled by the episodic reset, the structural feature of the show that prevented any event or development from carrying its weight into the following episode. This is the most common form of cancellation, and it is built into the show's format rather than representing any specific deliberate choice about any specific story. The Marge gambling addiction, the financial crises, the Bart academic trajectory. Each of these was canceled by the reset rather than by any specific decision not to continue them. Some storylines were canceled by circumstance external to the show. Phil Hartman's death ended the Troy McClure story. Marcia Wallace's death ended the Edna Krabappel continuation. These cancellations were not choices. They were losses that the show responded to with respect and with the pragmatic necessity of continuing without the people who would have told the stories. Some storylines were canceled by deliberate creative decisions whose rationale is not entirely clear. The continued development of Cecil Terwilliger, the continuation of the Italian Bob arc, the sustained examination of Apu's marriage. These feel like choices that were made, conscious or unconscious, to pull back from the depth that the earlier episodes had established. And some storylines were canceled not by a single decision, but by the accumulated drift of many small decisions, each of which was individually defensible toward a version of the show that was less interested in sustained character development and more interested in the comedic premise of the week. This is probably the most common form of deliberate cancellation, the form that produced the greatest loss over the longest period, precisely because it was not a single identifiable moment, but a gradual process that left no clear point of accountability. Understanding which form of cancellation applies to which storyline matters because it affects what the cancellation means. A storyline canceled by the episodic reset is not a story that was abandoned. It is a story that was never structurally capable of being maintained within the show's format. A storyline canceled by circumstance is not a story that was abandoned. It is a story that was interrupted by something outside the show's control. A storyline canceled by deliberate creative decision is something more specific and more worth examining, a choice not to go where the earlier episodes had established the story was going. The canceled storylines we have examined tonight are a mixture of all three forms. And part of what makes them interesting, part of what gives them the particular quality of incompleteness that distinguishes them from simply unfinished business, is that the form of their cancellation is not always immediately apparent. The show tells you sometimes that it has made a choice. The Armin Tamzarian episode was a deliberate creative decision with identifiable consequences. It was criticized for those consequences at the time and has been criticized for them since. The show, in some sense, acknowledged that it had made a choice. But the cancellation of Bob's redemption arc was never announced. The cancellation of Marge's gambling addiction story was never announced. The cancellation of Smithers' reckoning with Burns was never announced. These things simply stopped, and the show continued, and the canceled stories remained in the episodes that built toward them, without any marking to indicate that the building had stopped. The silence is, in this sense, the show's most consistent form of cancellation, not a decision that can be examined or evaluated or argued with, simply the absence of continuation. The story was being built here, and then it was not, and the gap between here and the continuation that should have followed is the canceled storyline itself. The silence is the cancellation. The cancellation is the silence. And Springfield maintains both with a consistency that has lasted 36 years. Bonus section on staying awake in Springfield. There is a reason this video is designed for the hours when sleep approaches rather than the hours when the day is beginning. The stories we have been telling tonight are stories for a specific kind of attention. The attention that is available when the day has finished, and the demands that the day makes have quieted, and the mind is between the clarity of full wakefulness and the diffusion of sleep. The attention that is loose enough to let the melancholy of these stories settle in without demanding that anything be done about it. The attention that can hold the weight of what was built and canceled without needing to assign blame or demand resolution. The canceled storylines of The Simpsons are, at their core, stories about potential unrealized, about capacity that was established and never fully exercised, about doors that were opened and not walked through, about the gap between what something was clearly becoming and what it actually became. These are not comfortable subjects in the full light of day. They have the quality of things that are easier to sit with when you are not entirely awake. When the edges of what you think about things are softer than they are at noon, when the melancholy of the unrealized has more room to be simply what it is rather than being immediately transformed into something actionable. So, the night is the right time for these stories. The slow, quiet hours when Springfield is most itself, when the comedy is less present and the darker truth underneath it is more visible, When the canceled storylines are less like failures and more like the natural condition of things that were built for a permanent present tense in which nothing could fully become what it was pointing toward. The permanent present is, in this way, not just the show's structural limitation, it is also its specific emotional truth. A world in which nothing changes, in which every reset restores the default condition, in which consequences do not accumulate and time does not pass, is a world that is very specifically organized against the possibility of loss. If nothing changes, you cannot lose anything. If consequences do not accumulate, the specific weight of what has happened does not press on you. If time does not pass, the things you love cannot leave you behind, or grow away from you, or become something you no longer recognize. The permanent present is a defense against grief. And the canceled storylines are all, in their different ways, the places where grief was approaching, and the permanent present reasserted itself to prevent it from arriving. Bob was going to lose his Italian life and grieve it. The show prevented the grief by canceling the arc that would have required him to carry it. Homer was going to have to grieve the version of himself that the crayon prevented him from being. The show prevented the grief by making him choose to put the crayon back. Lisa was going to have to grieve Springfield by leaving it. The show prevented the grief by keeping her 8 years old. Smithers was going to have to grieve the specific shape of his devotion to Burns by naming it clearly and discovering what Burns was and was not capable of returning. The show prevented the grief by deferring the naming indefinitely. The canceled storylines are, in this reading, the grief that the permanent present was protecting its characters from. The grief that was always approaching and always being turned back at the border of the reset. And there is something in this, in the specific shape of what was being protected against, that makes the canceled storylines feel less like simple narrative failures and more like the expression of a specific desire. The desire for a world in which the people you love do not have to grieve, in which Bart does not have to discover that growing up means losing the specific shape of his childhood, in which Marge does not have to carry the weight of what she did at the slot machine, in which Bob does not have to live in the wreckage of a life he worked to build and had taken from him. The permanent present is a kind of love, clumsy and structurally dishonest, and ultimately unable to deliver what it promises, but recognizable as love nonetheless. The desire to keep things from changing, to hold the people you have found in the exact shape they were when you found them, to prevent the passage of time from doing to them what time always does. It is Homer's love, in some ways. The specific quality of Homer's love for his family, which is enormous and genuine, and also slightly suffocating in the way that love, which cannot distinguish between holding someone and holding them back, is always slightly suffocating. Homer loves his family so much that he dreams them unchanged in his coma. The show loves its characters so much that it prevents them from aging in the permanent present. The two things have the same structure, the same desire, the same specific failure mode. The canceled storylines are what the desire to hold things unchanged costs. They are what you give up when you choose the permanent present over the passage of time. When you choose the house on Evergreen Terrace exactly as it is over the house on Evergreen Terrace 30 years from now, changed by everything that 30 years would change about it, you give up the stories that require time to tell. You give up Bob's redemption arc and Marge's recovery, and Lisa's departure, and Smithers's reckoning and Maggie's arrival. You give up the truth in exchange for the presence, and every night like this one, in the quiet between wakefulness and sleep, the truth comes back. Not to demand anything, not to insist on the resolution that was canceled, just to be present in the space that the night makes available for it, to remind you that the stories are still there, that the potential is still there, that the doors are still ajar. And then morning comes, and Springfield is still Springfield, and Homer is still going to work, and the house is still there, and the family is still on the couch. And the canceled storylines are still waiting, as they always have, as they always will. Good night, Springfield. Good night to all the stories that were almost told. Good night to Bob in Italy, to Marge at the slot machine, to Maggie watching the ceiling, to Smithers carrying 30 years, to Lisa still 8 years old with the whole world ahead of her and the permanent present holding her exactly where she is. Good night to all of it. We will be back. We always come back. That is the nature of a place that has never let anyone go. Thank you. If this helped you find sleep, or if you stayed awake through all of it because the stories would not let you go, that means something. Drop a comment with where you are in the world and what the clock says. And subscribe if you want to come back to Springfield again. There are more nights like this one, and the quiet roads here go on longer than anyone has yet followed them. Bonus section: the minor characters with major stories. There are characters in Springfield who appear so consistently and who are drawn with such specific human detail that their presence across hundreds of episodes constitutes an implicit promise of a story that was never told. We have examined some of the major ones. There are others. Otto Mann, the school bus driver, is one of the show's most consistent background presences. He is depicted with a specific and consistent set of qualities: his relationship with music, his relationship with substances, his particular quality of cheerfulness that coexists with circumstances that, objectively, should not produce cheerfulness. He has a van. He has a girlfriend, at various points, depicted with varying depth depending on the episode. He has a professional relationship to Springfield Elementary that constitutes the entirety of his civic function, and the show established, across dozens of appearances, the beginning of a portrait that it never completed. Otto's cheerfulness is not the cheerfulness of someone for whom everything is fine. It is the cheerfulness of someone who has found a way to be present in a life that, by conventional measures, is not going well, without requiring the life to be going well in order to maintain the presence. That is a specific and recognizable way of being in the world. It is not simply the comedy of someone whose drug use prevents him from registering the shape of his circumstances. It is something more interesting, a genuine philosophy of presence, however arrived at, that produces a kind of contentment that people with considerably more conventional success do not always manage. The story of how Otto arrived at that philosophy, what his life looked like before Springfield Elementary's bus driver became his professional identity, what he wanted when he was younger, and what the gap between what he wanted and what he has is, and how he has navigated that gap, was never told. There are small pieces of it in individual episodes, but the portrait was never assembled. Then there is groundskeeper Willie, whose backstory the show established with surprising specificity in its Scottish detail, and whose specific quality of furious dignity in the face of an institution that consistently treats him as expendable was one of the show's most consistent recurring portraits of a certain kind of working-class experience. Willie had been wronged by Springfield in ways the show documented across multiple episodes. His various grievances were specific. His responses to those grievances were theatrical and specific and charged with the particular energy of someone who has been given no legitimate channel for his frustrations, and who has therefore developed illegitimate channels with considerable creativity. The story of who Willie was before he was Springfield Elementary's groundskeeper, and of what the specific path of his life had looked like from its beginning to the point at which the show encountered him, was never told. Small pieces of it were established. A Scottish past with its own complications, a family history that the show referenced in fragments without assembling, a professional history at the school that stretched back further than the show's own history and that implied a relationship to the institution that was not simply one of employment. The assembled story of Willie, the full portrait of a man whose relationship with dignity and with the systematic indignities of his working life was one of the show's most consistent themes, was canceled in favor of the recurring premise. Willie in a difficult situation, Willie's reaction to the difficult situation, Willie's furious and usually ineffective response, and Lunch Lady Doris. And the various Springfield police officers beyond Chief Wiggum, each of whom was drawn with enough specificity to suggest a full human life behind the badge. And the Springfield teacher who appeared in certain episodes with a competence and a dedication that contrasted sharply with the institutional context that was making both of those things difficult to sustain. These are the minor characters whose stories were canceled not by the episodic reset or by circumstance or by deliberate creative choice, but by the simple structural limitation of a show that had more characters than it had space to examine. The background characters whose consistent presence constituted a promise of examination that the show's finite episode count and finite narrative attention made impossible to fulfill, they are all still there, all still going about the specific versions of their Springfield lives that the show established in the aggregate of their appearances, all still carrying the stories that were suggested in those appearances and never assembled into anything coherent. The background of Springfield is full of these canceled stories. The unexamined lives of the people who populate the town's margins. The specific human histories that the show's visual and comedic attention documented in fragments without ever committing to the whole. Every wide shot of Springfield showing the town going about its business contains, in the specific details of the people filling the frame, hundreds of stories that were never told. They are still there, in every wide shot, every crowd scene, every background moment where a Springfield resident is living their specific Springfield life just outside the frame's primary attention. The town is full of canceled stories. It always was. It always will be. Bonus section: the Springfield that existed before The Simpsons. One of the show's most consistently underexplored subjects was the Springfield that existed before Homer and Marge moved to Evergreen Terrace, before the children were born, before the show's narrative began. The early seasons established that Springfield had a history that predated the show's present by decades. Burns's ownership of the power plant went back decades. The various civic institutions of the town had histories that stretched back to founding moments that the show occasionally referenced. The neighborhoods of Springfield had the specific quality of places that had been through multiple economic and social cycles and were currently in a particular phase of that cycling. And various episodes across the show's run established specific glimpses of the pre-show Springfield. The 1960s Springfield depicted in Mother Simpson. The wartime Springfield referenced in various Burns-related episodes. The founding Springfield glimpsed in occasional historical flashbacks. The Springfield of Homer and Marge's parents' generation, which was a different town in specific and documented ways from the Springfield of the show's present. The story that all these glimpses were pointing toward was the history of Springfield as a place, how it came to be what it was, what series of decisions and circumstances and economic forces had produced the specific town that the show depicted, what the arc of the town's story looked like over the decades before the Simpsons arrived on Evergreen Terrace. This would have been, in some sense, the show's most ambitious storyline, the history of the show's own setting, told with enough specificity and enough honest attention to the actual forces that shape American communities to illuminate why Springfield is the way it is. The show had the material for this. It had Burns's history with the town, which stretched back to the plant's founding. It had the political history suggested by the Quimby dynasty, and the institutional history suggested by the Stonecutters, and the civic history suggested by the various monuments and founding documents and historical references scattered across the episodes. It had, in other words, everything needed to tell the story of how Springfield became Springfield. That story was never told. What was canceled was the history of the show's own setting, the story behind the story. The specific and particular account of how a place becomes what it is, told through the accumulated decisions and forces and accidents that the show had been documenting in fragments across its entire run. The story of Springfield's origin is still there, in pieces, in hundreds of episodes that established specific facts about specific times in the town's past. Those pieces have never been assembled into a coherent history. They are still there, still waiting. In the archives of a town that has canceled time and therefore cannot have a history in the conventional sense, but which has accumulated, across 36 years of episodes, the fragments of the history it cannot officially acknowledge. The history of Springfield is Springfield's most quietly canceled storyline. It has been building since the first episode. It is nowhere near finished. Bonus section: the show's own awareness of what it was doing. The Simpsons, across its run, has shown occasional signs of awareness of its own pattern of canceled storylines. Not always directly. Sometimes in the specific way that a show demonstrates self-awareness, which is by telling a story about something adjacent to what it is actually doing. The most direct acknowledgement was the episode about Principal Skinner's true identity. The show, in that episode, depicted a community choosing to cancel the truth and maintain the comfortable fiction. The town voted against acknowledging what had happened. The judge made it illegal to remember. The real Skinner was exiled. The show was, in that episode, depicting its own mechanism, the mechanism by which Springfield maintained its permanent present, the collective agreement to not acknowledge what had happened, the active expulsion of anyone who insisted on the truth. And then the show continued, and the next episode began, and Springfield was Springfield again, and everything was as it had been before. That is itself a form of acknowledgement. The show depicted the mechanism, named it, showed it operating in real time, and then used it again in the next episode. The self-awareness was complete enough to identify the pattern and not complete enough to break it. There are other moments of this kind across the show's run. Episodes that seem to be about the show itself, about the permanent present and its costs, about the specific quality of a world in which consequences do not accumulate and time does not pass. Each of these moments is a brief, bright acknowledgement of what the show is doing and why. And each of them is followed by another episode, and the pattern continues. The show knows what it is doing. It has always known. The knowledge has never been sufficient to change what it does. That is, in some ways, the most honest thing about The Simpsons. It knows about the permanent present, it knows about the canceled storylines, it knows about the deferred consequences and the maintained fictions and the exiled truths. It depicts these things with clarity and even with affection, and it continues them anyway, because the alternative, as the show has understood since the beginning, is an ending, and the show is not ending. The show is not allowed to end. The permanent present will not allow it. And so the show continues, with full knowledge of what continuing costs, with full awareness of the stories that cannot be told inside the permanent present, with occasional, carefully contained acknowledgments of the mechanism that prevents those stories from being told, and it continues anyway. That continuation is not simply commercial calculation, though it is partly that. It is also something more specific to what the show is and what the permanent present means. It is the show's commitment, renewed with every episode, to being the thing that continues, the thing that is always there, the thing that provides the specific comfort of an unchanging world in a world that changes constantly and often badly. The Simpsons continues because people need it to continue. Because there is something in the specific quality of the permanent present, something in the house on Evergreen Terrace and the yellow faces and the couch and Homer coming home at 5:30 after another day at the plant, that provides something that the canceled storylines could not have provided. The canceled storylines would have given you truth. The permanent present gives you presence. Both are valuable. The show chose one, and 36 years later, in the quiet before sleep, we are still choosing to spend time with what it chose. That says something about the show, about what we need from it, about the specific way that a world that will not change can become, over time, the most reliable thing we know. Good night, all of it, all of Springfield, all of the permanent present, all of the canceled storylines, still waiting in the episodes that built toward them. Good night to the show that knows exactly what it is doing and does it anyway. Good night. Bonus section. The story still being built. This is the quietest part of the night. The part where everything slows, where the thoughts become less urgent and the details soften, and the space between consciousness and sleep becomes the whole world. And in that space, let us take one last look at Springfield. Not at the canceled stories, not at the abandoned threads or the deferred resolutions, or the permanent present and its mechanisms of maintenance, but at what is still there. What the 36 years of Springfield have left behind, what remains in spite of everything. The house at 742 Evergreen Terrace is still there. It is exactly where it was in 1989, on a street in a town whose location is permanently ambiguous, in a present tense that has been maintained across 3.5 decades with a consistency that has required considerable sacrifice. And inside the house, everyone who has always been there is still there. Homer is still there, still going to work every morning, still loving his family with the specific quality of Homer's love, enormous and genuine and occasionally suffocating and completely impossible to doubt, still falling down and getting up, still not understanding things that would be better understood and understanding, with surprising clarity and surprising depth, the things that matter most to him, his family, the specific warmth of the house he lives in, the particular comfort of being exactly where he is, with exactly the people he is with, in exactly the moment the show is depicting. Marge is still there, still patient, still carrying more than she shows, still finding, in the daily management of an imperfect household and an imperfect life, something that is genuinely hers, genuinely chosen, genuinely valued. The canceled storylines did not find the whole of Marge, but the episodes did not fail to find her. She is there, in every episode that showed her choosing her family again, quietly and without announcement, in the specific way that choices that are made every day and never narrated are the deepest choices. Bart is still there, still 10 years old, still finding more joy in disruption than in conformity, still carrying, underneath the performance, the actual person who appeared briefly in episodes like The Bart Wants What It Wants, the person who does not entirely know what he needs but who is reaching for it in the only ways he knows. The cancelled storylines did not reach what Bart was reaching toward, but the episodes did not fail to document the reaching. Lisa is still there, still 8 years old, still asking the questions nobody wants to answer, still refusing to stop asking them, still finding, in the specific difficulty of her position, both genuine suffering and genuine strength. The cancelled storylines did not follow Lisa to the place she was pointing toward, but the episodes did not fail to establish who she was and why the place she was pointing toward mattered. And Maggie is still there, still watching, still waiting, still extraordinary behind the pacifier and the enormous eyes and the 36 years of deliberate silence. Whatever she is planning, she has not yet decided the time has come. But she has been watching for a very long time. She knows everything that happened in every episode. She knows every cancelled story. She has been watching the show build all of it, and she has been watching the show cancel all of it, and she has been noting both in that specific way she notes things with total attention and perfect retention and no visible reaction. And when she finally decides that the time has come, when she finally breaks the silence that she has maintained for 36 years, when the pacifier comes out and the first real sentence is spoken aloud in Springfield for the first time, whatever she says will contain all of it. All the cancelled stories, all the deferred consequences, all the exiled truths, all the 36 years of watching. It will be the most important thing anyone has ever said in Springfield. It will settle everything that was left unsettled. It will be the moment the permanent present finally gives way. We do not know when that moment is coming. We do not know if it is coming. The show has been building toward it for 36 years and may go on building toward it for 36 more without it arriving, but it is being built toward. In the quiet of the house on Evergreen Terrace, in the dim light of the nursery, Maggie Simpson is watching the ceiling. She is planning something. She has always been planning something. And when it arrives, when the planning finally becomes action, when the silence finally becomes speech, Springfield will not be the same town it was before. Nothing will. But until that moment, the night is quiet. The cooling towers glow softly against the dark sky. The Quickie Mart is open and lit. The house at 742 Evergreen Terrace is dark. Everyone is asleep. Almost everyone. Sleep now. Let Springfield hold you for a while. Let the permanent present do what it was built to do. Let the family stay exactly as they are, frozen in amber, preserved against time, unchanged by the passage of the years that have passed outside the window of the screen. Let the cancelled stories rest in the episodes that built them, quietly present in the background of every frame, waiting with the specific patience of things that have nowhere else to go. They are not going anywhere. Neither are you. Sleep. Springfield will be here when you wake. It always is. That is the whole point. That is all of it. Good night. For anyone still awake, thank you for every minute of this. Drop a comment with your location and time, and subscribe if you want to come back to Springfield on other quiet nights. The show has been running for 36 years, and there are more stories in it than we can walk through in any single night. We will be back. Bonus section: The Sound of Springfield at Night. There is a specific quality to Springfield at night that the show has never depicted directly, but that all its daytime depictions imply. The town is quieter at night than it is during the day, obviously, but the specific quality of its quiet is distinct from the quiet of other fictional towns. It is the quiet of a place that has been through a great deal and has decided collectively not to think about most of it. The quiet of a town that has implemented a specific policy toward its own history and maintains that policy through the permanent present. At night, the policy is most visible. During the day, Springfield is busy with the machinery of its various ongoing comedic situations. The nuclear plant humming, the Quickie Mart cycling through its customers, the school holding its various institutional dysfunctions in place through the sheer force of routine, Moe's Tavern performing the specific function of a place where people go when the rest of their daily lives has temporarily released them. The streets filled with the usual population of a cartoon American small city, going about their usual business, maintaining the usual fictions that allow a town to function without constantly confronting what it actually is. At night, the machinery slows. The Quickie Mart is still open, because the Quickie Mart is always open, but the foot traffic decreases and Apu is more alone with the fluorescent hum and the specific quality of what his nights in that store actually consist of. The nuclear plant continues its operations, because the nuclear plant never stops, but the human element inside it reduces to a skeleton crew, and the building takes on the quality of a thing that functions without requiring much from the humans nominally in charge of it. The houses settle into their respective silences, each one containing whatever the day's worth of the permanent present has deposited inside it. The cancelled stories breathe a little easier at night. The pressure of the reset is slightly less immediate. The noise that fills Springfield's daytime and renders invisible the things that the permanent present would prefer to remain invisible is quieter. And in the quiet, the shape of what was built and not finished becomes more visible. You can hear, if you listen carefully, the specific quality of Bob's absence from the Italian village, the specific weight of what Smithers is carrying, the specific quality of Marge's composure and what it costs her to maintain it, the specific patience of Maggie's watching. You can hear all of it, at this hour, in the way that you can sometimes hear, in the quiet before sleep, the things that you carry without knowing you are carrying them. The cancelled stories of Springfield are like that. They were always being carried. The permanent present carried them without acknowledging them. The episodic reset everything around them but could not reset them, because they were not the events that had happened but the weight of what those events implied. And weight, unlike events, does not reset. So the weight is still there. It has been accumulating since the first episode. 36 years of stories that were built toward and not followed. 36 years of potential unrealized. 36 years of the permanent present choosing the fiction over the truth, choosing presence over passage, choosing the house on Evergreen Terrace, unchanged over the house on Evergreen Terrace 30 years from now. The weight of that choice is the substance of this night. We have been sitting with it for hours. And now sleep is approaching, the way it always approaches, with the specific gentleness of something that does not need to force itself, that simply becomes the only available option once the resistance has been worn down to nothing. Let it come. Let Springfield recede into the background the way it does at the end of every episode. Not ending, never ending, just temporarily beyond the frame. The house is still there. The family is still there. The cancelled stories are still there, waiting with the patience that has always characterized them. And you are here, wherever here is, at whatever hour this is, having spent a long time in their company. That means something. Good night. Bonus section, what Maggie knows. If Maggie Simpson has been watching for 36 years, and if her intelligence is what the show has consistently established it to be, then what does she know? She knows about her father's coma, if the coma theory is real. She has been present for every moment since April 1993. She has been watching the dream, if that is what it is, from inside it. She has been a participant in the simulation and also, by virtue of her extraordinary intelligence and her deliberate silence, something like an observer of the simulation. She is both inside the permanent present and aware of the permanent present in a way that no other character is capable of being. She knows about Burns. She knows what he did to her grandmother. She has been present in the house when the details of Mona's story were discussed. She has been present in the room when the various ramifications of Burns's power over the Simpson family were made visible. She has been watching her father go to work every day for a man who destroyed the family her father came from, and she has been watching her father not connect the dots, and she has been holding what she knows about those dots with the specific patience that defines everything about her. She knows about her sister's Buddhism and what it implies. She has been present for every episode of Lisa's spiritual development. She has been watching the framework being built and watching the show fail to use it, and watching Lisa continue to apply the framework anyway in the specific, stubborn way that Lisa approaches everything. She knows about the money. She has been present in the house through every financial crisis. She has presumably, with the cognitive ability that the show has documented across dozens of episodes, done the arithmetic herself. She knows what Homer earns and what the family spends and what the gap between those figures means for the long-term viability of the life at 742 Evergreen Terrace. She has been carrying this knowledge for 36 years without sharing it, because sharing it would require explaining how she knows it, which would require revealing that she has been tracking it, which would reveal her intelligence, which is the one thing she has determined must remain concealed. She knows about Smithers. She has been in Burns's office. She has been in rooms where Smithers's devotion to Burns was visible to anyone paying attention. She has been paying attention. She understands what she has been watching in a way that no other character in the show understands it. She knows about her brother's emotional life in the specific way that only someone who has been watching without participating can know it. She has seen all the moments where Bart's defenses slipped and something genuine was briefly visible. She has watched him miss the connection with Greta Wolfcastle. She has watched him miss various other connections and opportunities. She has been watching the person he could become in the way that she watches everything with total attention and no intervention. And she has said nothing. She has done nothing. She has maintained the silence that she has apparently determined is the optimal response to everything she knows. The question of why is the question the show has been building toward for 36 years. Why does Maggie watch and not act? Why does she know and not speak? Why does she see the whole shape of what is happening in her family and in her town and in the permanent present that maintains them all, and choose, continuously, to remain behind the pacifier? The show has suggested various answers. The strategic silence theory, that Maggie understands, from watching Lisa, what happens to people who display their intelligence openly in Springfield, and has concluded that invisibility is more useful than visibility. The protective silence theory, that Maggie is protecting someone or something by not speaking, the way that someone who knows a dangerous truth sometimes protects people by keeping it. The waiting silence theory, that Maggie is biding her time, accumulating information and preparing for a moment she has not yet determined has arrived. None of these are mutually exclusive. They may all be true simultaneously. What is certain is that Maggie knows. She has always known. She will continue to know as she continues to watch, through every episode that follows this one and every episode that followed the first one. And whatever she is going to do with what she knows, she has not yet decided to do it. The night is quiet. The house is dark. Maggie is watching the ceiling. Whatever is coming from that watching, it is still coming, slowly, patiently, with the specific quality of something that has been in preparation for 36 years and is not yet finished preparing. Sleep now. She will still be there when you wake up. She will still be watching. She always will be. Final thoughts. The permanent present and the people inside it. 36 years. Nearly 800 episodes. The longest-running scripted primetime show in American history. And inside all of that, in the specific and private space of every episode that built towards something and did not follow through, in every character who was given depth that implied a direction and then held at their default position, in every canceled arc and every abandoned thread, and every door that was opened and left ajar, there is a version of The Simpsons that was always there and was never quite told. We have spent this night in the company of that version. We have followed its threads as far as they go, which is to say, far enough to see where they were pointing, but not as far as the episodes themselves chose to go. What we have found is not a story of failure. The canceled storylines are not failures. They are evidence of ambition. Evidence that the show knew, from the beginning, that the characters it was building were capable of sustaining real journeys toward real conclusions. Evidence that the writers who built those characters were building toward something more than the episodic premise of the week. The ambition was real. The building was real. The potential was real and is real and remains real in every episode that contributed to it, perfectly preserved in the amber of the permanent present that prevented the potential from being realized. That is the nature of The Simpsons and of Springfield and of the stories that were almost told. They are always almost told. They are always in the process of almost arriving. They have been almost arriving for 36 years. And the almost is not nothing. The almost is, in its specific way, everything. The almost is the show's most honest statement about itself and about the world it was always depicting. A world that keeps almost solving its problems. That keeps almost confronting its truths. That keeps almost allowing the people inside it to become who they are capable of becoming. That keeps almost letting the permanent present give way to the passage of time. Not yet, but almost. Always almost. And in the almost everything we have talked about tonight is still living, still waiting, still pointed toward the resolution that has not yet arrived and may not arrive in any episode we will see, but it is pointed toward it, consistently, patiently, across 36 years and nearly 800 episodes, pointed toward it. That is not nothing. That is perhaps the most human thing about the show, the most recognizable, the most true to what it actually feels like to be a person in the world, which is to be always almost arriving at the person you were going to be, always almost saying the thing you meant to say, always almost following the thread to where it was pointing. The Simpsons is the most human show because it is always almost. And tonight, in the quiet before sleep, we have been with the almost. We have given it the attention it deserved but never quite received. We have followed it to the edges of the episodes that contained it. And now it is late. And the night is quiet. And Springfield is doing what it always does when the episode ends. Maintaining its permanent present. Holding everything in place. Waiting for the next episode to begin. And for everything to continue as it always has. Homer is almost home. Lisa is almost out. Bart is almost himself. Marge is almost seen. Maggie is almost speaking. Almost. Always almost. Good night. This was a long night in Springfield. Wherever you are and whatever time it is there, thank you for spending it here. Leave a comment with your location and time. Subscribe if you want more nights like this one. And get some sleep. The stories will still be almost told in the morning. They always are. Bonus section. The long middle of Homer's life. There is a period in Homer Simpson's life that the show has never examined directly. It is the period between when the show begins and when the show began. Homer in the pilot episode is approximately 36 years old, married to Marge, father of 3 children, employed at the Springfield nuclear power plant, living in the house on Evergreen Terrace. These are the established facts of his existence, and the show has maintained them with the floating timelines adjustments for 36 years. But the show begins in the middle of a life that has been going on for a long time already. Homer has been married to Marge for more than a decade by the time the show starts. He has been working at the plant for long enough that his tenure there is a given rather than a recent development. He has been living in Springfield for long enough that Springfield is simply where he lives rather than a place he recently arrived. The show has, across its various flashback episodes, constructed a partial biography of the period before the pilot. We know something about Homer's high school years. We know something about how he and Marge met. We know something about the early years of their marriage and the arrival of the children. We know something about how Homer came to be employed at the nuclear plant. But the assembled picture is fragmentary and frequently contradictory, as the floating timeline has required the backstory to be revised across episodes to maintain the illusion that the character's age relative to the show's present has remained consistent. What we have never had is the complete middle of Homer's life. The years between the childhood glimpsed in the flashbacks and the adulthood depicted in the pilot. The years of the marriage before the show started. The specific texture of what The Simpsons' daily life looked like in 1985 or 1987 or 1989, in the years just before the show began, when the family was settling into the specific shape it would have when the first episode aired. These are not simply missing years in a biography. They are the years that explain a great deal about who Homer is when the show begins, why he is the way he is with Marge, why he is the way he is with the children, why his relationship with work has the specific quality of resigned acceptance that it has, why his friendships have the shape they have, why he is, in all the specific ways that he is, exactly himself in exactly this configuration. The origin story of Homer Simpson's adulthood, the long middle that produced the man the pilot introduces, was never told directly. It was implied and partially established and occasionally glimpsed in fragments. But the full story of how a young man who showed, in the glimpsed flashbacks, genuine sweetness and genuine capability and genuine aspiration, became the specific Homer Simpson of the pilot, was never assembled. That origin story is, in some sense, the most important canceled storyline of all. Because all the other canceled storylines, the ones that branch off from the show's present, are rooted in what Homer became before the show began. His relationship to his father, his relationship to the memory of his mother, his relationship to work and to Burns, his relationship to the life he is living and the life he was going to live. All of it traces back to the long middle that the show never told. Homer is, in this reading, a character whose most important story predates the show that tells his story. The show began in the aftermath. We have been watching the aftermath for 36 years without ever being shown what the aftermath was, the aftermath of. That is the most quietly canceled storyline in the show's history. Not abandoned, because it was never begun, but present in every episode as the unseen foundation on which everything the show has depicted was built. The show of Homer's middle years, the origin of the man we know. That show was never made, and Springfield keeps going, in the permanent present, built on a foundation the show chose never to fully illuminate. Bonus section: the specific silence of the space between episodes. In the space between the end of one Simpsons episode and the beginning of the next, something happens that the show never depicts, but that the canceled storylines all require. The reset. We know it as a narrative mechanism. The show ends one episode, and when the next begins, everything that happened in the previous episode has been returned to its default position. The financial disaster is resolved. The relationship crisis is over. The character development is reversed. The Springfield that faces the camera at the start of the new episode is the Springfield that was there before the previous episode made its various changes. But what does the reset actually look like? What happens in Springfield between 9:01 on a Sunday night and 8:59 on the following Sunday? This is a question the show has never directly answered, partly because answering it would require acknowledging that the reset is happening, which would require acknowledging that the permanent present is a constructed condition rather than a natural one. The canceled storylines are all, in a sense, casualties of what happens in that space between episodes. They were built in individual episodes, assembled with genuine care across multiple episodes in some cases, and then quietly undone in the between-episode space where the reset operates. The reset is Springfield's maintenance routine. It runs in the background, between episodes, restoring default conditions, resolving the storylines that the episodes introduced by simply making them not have happened, or not have mattered, or not have left the marks that they would have left if the show were interested in letting them leave marks. The canceled storylines are the stories that the reset never quite finished erasing, the emotional weight that survived the maintenance routine. The potential that the background process could dissolve the events that established it, but could not dissolve the implication of those events. You cannot reset the implication that Bob is capable of building a real life, even after you reset the Italian village. The potential survives the erasure of its evidence. You cannot reset the implication that Marge's composure has a limit, and what lies beneath that limit is real, even after you reset the gambling addiction. The psychological truth survives the erasure of the episode that revealed it. You cannot reset the implication that Maggie is extraordinary, even after you reset any single demonstration of her extraordinary quality. 36 years of evidence survives any individual episode's failure to acknowledge it. The reset is powerful. It has maintained the permanent present for 36 years with remarkable consistency. But it cannot erase potential. It cannot erase implication. It cannot erase the accumulated weight of everything the show built before it decided not to follow through. The canceled storylines live in what the reset cannot reach. In the implication, in the potential, in the accumulated weight, they are still there. In every episode that contributed to them. In every character who carries the weight of a story that was built but not told. In every moment where the show was almost honest about what it was doing and what it was building toward, the reset runs. The permanent present holds, Springfield continues. And in the space between episodes, in the maintenance routine that restores default conditions, in the background process that has been running for 36 years, the canceled stories breathe, quietly. With the patience of things that have no particular urgency because they have nowhere else to be. They have always been here. They will always be here. In the space between the end of one episode and the beginning of the next. In the specific silence of the reset. In the Springfield that exists when the cameras are not running. That Springfield is the one where all the canceled stories live. We cannot visit it directly. The show does not take us there. It only shows us the Springfield of the permanent present, the Springfield that faces the camera, the Springfield where everything is always restored to its default condition, and no story has any weight it carried over from a previous episode. But we know it is there. We know it must be there, because the potential is there, because the implication is there, because 36 years of building has produced something that the reset cannot fully dissolve. The Springfield between episodes is where Bob is still in Italy, where Marge is still at the slot machine, where Smithers is still carrying what he is carrying, where Lisa is still 8 years old and still pointing toward a place she has not yet been allowed to reach, where Maggie is still planning. That Springfield is right behind the one the show depicts, one reset away from being visible, one episode away from the permanent present giving way, always one away, always almost. Sleep now. Let the reset run. Let Springfield restore itself to its default condition for the morning. The canceled stories will still be there when the next episode begins. In the space between, as always, as they will always be. Good night. A last note? On watching. You have been watching Springfield tonight. Watching the stories that were built and not finished. Watching the characters who were given depth and not given direction. Watching the permanent present maintain itself through every episode and every reset and every canceled storyline that was quietly absorbed back into the default condition. And in watching, you have been doing something that Springfield's characters cannot do. You have been watching from outside the permanent present, from the place where time actually passes, from the position of someone who has been here for 36 years or some portion of 36 years, watching a world that has not changed. You have changed. The world outside Springfield has changed, but Springfield has held. And in the holding, in the specific quality of a world that refuses to change while the world outside it changes constantly, there is something that keeps being worth returning to. Something that the canceled storylines, for all their unrealized potential, cannot provide. Something that only the permanent present, maintained with all the cost that maintaining it requires, can offer. Constancy. Homer is still Homer. Marge is still Marge. Bart is still 10. Lisa is still 8. Maggie is still watching. The house is still there. The family is still on the couch. The show still ends every Sunday night with the credits rolling and the music playing and everyone exactly where they were at the beginning of the episode. That constancy is the show's gift to us. The one thing it has always been able to offer that no canceled storyline, however well built and however honestly told, could have given in the same way. Because concluded stories are over. They reach their endings and they are done. But a story in permanent present tense is never over. It is always available to return to, always exactly as it was. Always there when the night gets quiet and the desire for its company becomes strong enough. The canceled storylines were building toward endings, toward conclusions, toward the specific resolution that each character's arc required. And in reaching those endings, they would have been finished. The permanent present is not finished. It will not be finished. That is both its specific limitation and its specific gift. What was canceled was the endings. What was kept was everything that comes before the ending. And everything that comes before the ending is what we have been in the company of tonight. All of it. Every piece of building that the show committed to across 36 years. Every character developed with care. Every story begun with genuine intention. Every thread introduced with real conviction that it was going somewhere. All of it is still here, still preserved, still available for this kind of attention. Still worth coming back to, still worth spending a long night in the company of. The night is almost over now. The stories have been as fully examined as this particular night allows. Springfield is quiet at this hour, which is the same hour it has always been quiet at, the permanent present maintaining its condition. And somewhere in the quiet of the house, at 742 Evergreen Terrace, in the specific dark of the small hours, when even the permanent present is as close to resting as it gets, everyone is exactly where they have always been. Homer and Marge asleep upstairs, carrying between them the weight of 36 years of the life the show depicted and the life it did not. Bart asleep in his room, carrying the potential of everything the show established about who he could be and has not yet allowed him to become. Lisa asleep, or not quite asleep, reading perhaps, carrying the weight of being who she is in the place she is in, and the certainty that this is not permanent, even as the permanent present holds it as though it is. And Maggie, still watching, still planning, still holding everything she knows with the patience that defines her. The most extraordinary person in Springfield, in the most unassuming form imaginable, in the crib at the end of the hall, watching, waiting, knowing. Good night to all of it. Good night to Homer. Good night to Marge. Good night to Bart and Lisa. And good night, Maggie. We know what you know, or we almost do. Always almost. Good night, Good night, Springfield. We will be back.